Chapter 61. "Let's see what you've got, Charles," the Red Earl called, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. He took a step back to where his umbrella lay half buried in the sand, bent down, and withdrew it with a swift motion. "Show me your swordsmanship." With a sharp clang, Charles swung his blade in a horizontal arc. The steel edge, wreathed in a glow of martial energy, met the Red Earl's umbrella head-on. A shower of sparks flew as metal crashed against metal. The Red Earl's umbrella whirled with practiced precision, its canopy flickering like a phantom shield. Charles's eyes narrowed. His opponent's technique was astonishingly fast. But under the pressure, an unexpected clarity came to him. He recognized the Red Earl's own fighting style, as if it had been engraved in his mind. Gathering his focus, Charles channeled that same fluid grace. More sparks erupted with each exchange. Clang, clang, clang. Two glowing blades of aura-streaked steel and iron dancing in the midday sun. The umbrella rose and fell in sweeping arcs. Charles's sword riposted with rippling parries. Every strike rang out, relentless and precise. Finally, Charles held his guard firm, tip of his sword pressing lightly against the umbrella's rim. He offered a breathless nod of respect. "Excellent blade work," he said, voice steady. The Red Earl's smile deepened in return. The Red Earl's swordsmanship was bewilderingly swift, his form a blur as he swept across the yard, every feint and thrust designed to hunt down an opponent's weakest point. Merciless and relentless, his style was unlike anything Charles had ever faced. At first, Charles found himself driven back, his blade nearly wrenched from his hand as he struggled to match that unholy rhythm. But gradually he began to discern the pattern, a flourish here, a retreat there. Once the cadence clicked, his own swordplay fell into place. "Impressive," the Red Earl finally admitted, his steel blue eyes gleaming with the thrill of combat. In all his years of training, he'd never sparred with anyone who could keep pace with his lightning-fast assaults. What fascinated him most was Charles's counter, an artful play of opening and closing distance that seemed to echo the Red Earl's own tactics, offering fresh insight with every exchanged strike. Their blades met with a ringing clang, and Charles seized the moment to step back, creating space between them. He steadied his breath, raised his sword, and called out, "Break the ground!" In an instant, a crackling wave of sword energy shot downward, splintering the earth before hurtling straight at the Red Earl. The Red Earl didn't even attempt to dodge Charles's slash. Instead, he unleashed a surge of blade chi that gouged into the earth, meeting Charles's ground cleave head-on. The collision echoed like thunder, both strikes locking together in a blinding flash of steel, ripping a crater in the battlefield. "Great swordsman!" Cyborg Sora exclaimed, hardly believing what he'd just witnessed. Warring States leaned forward, studying the pair on the screen with grave intensity. "They've both ascended to great swordsmen," he murmured, and by the strength of that blow, Charles must have finally broken through his limits after his duel with Zephyr. Where Cyborg Sora's reaction was all excitement, Warring States remained composed, methodically assessing every detail. Still, even he couldn't hide his astonishment. "Damn it, just who is this man?" Steelbone Kong clenched his fists, picturing another pirate of Charles's caliber rising in the world, and felt nothing but fury. Just then, General He hurried over, a dossier clutched in one hand. He paused before the group, voice low but urgent. "I've confirmed the Red Earl's true identity," he announced. "He's only been a wanted criminal for the past 2 years, and we now know exactly what drove him down that path." Admiral Crane slid a datapad across the conference table to Commander Steelbone Konghao. "This just came from Navy headquarters," he said. Konghao tapped the screen. His mechanical fingers flicked through the files, then he slammed a metal fist onto the table. "Reward posted for the so-called Red Earl, accused of murdering a corrupt nobleman, and now branded a pirate. How can they be so blind?" Admiral Warring States bristled beside him. "Lieutenant General." He rubbed his temples. "It's done. That arrest warrant and bounty are public. HQ won't back down just because we argue he's no criminal. We have to figure out our next move." He straightened and added, "And now he's in contact with Charles. If the Red Earl's planning to join forces with the Rock's pirates, that uncertainty makes him even more dangerous. We need to resolve this quickly, before it spirals out of control." Fleet Admiral Sengoku, who'd been studying the three of them in silence, finally spoke. His calm voice cut through the tension. Commander Kongho, since headquarters refuses to rescind the bounty, present your strategy. How do we handle the Red Earl and Charles before this situation turns catastrophic? Chapter 7. A Call for Reinforcements. Admiral Steelbone Kong pressed his fingertips to his temples, trying to stifle the rising headache. His two chief strategists had delivered the same grim verdict. Navy headquarters simply lacked the manpower to take on the Red Earl. Confronting the pirate lord was beyond a one-man operation. Even a supreme commander like Kong couldn't act alone. As admiral of the fleet, Kong held enormous authority, but he also carried immense responsibility. He couldn't abandon Murin Fando without good reason. The last time he attempted to dispatch his personal squadron, the 5 old stars nearly overruled him. The Navy's senior officers demanded that nothing short of a full-blown emergency would justify his absence from headquarters. He glanced toward General Zhang Guo, who stood ready to volunteer for the mission. Kong appreciated Zhang Guo's prowess, but he had no confidence that the general could subdue the Red Earl swiftly, or that Charles, his young protege waiting nearby, would emerge unscathed. If word got out that the Navy had sent only a handful of officers against the notorious pirate, their prestige would suffer irreparable damage. Before long, every corsair on the high seas would be emboldened. Kong sighed. "Gentlemen," he said, straightening in his chair, "we cannot proceed with our current forces. It's clear, we must expand the fleet before we challenge the Red Earl. Let's convene the Admiralty Council at once and hammer out a plan." Around the polished mahogany table, eyes met with solemn agreement. The Navy faced a looming crisis, and the only solution was to summon reinforcements, fast. At naval headquarters, the report came in sharp and unwelcome. "They can't spare any ships to surround Charles and the Red Earl. All we can do is wait and see." Cyborg Kong delivered the news with a heavy sigh. Beside him, Sora the Cyborg, Sengoku, and Crane exchanged muted nods. Each understood the Navy's stretched thin predicament. On the deserted island, the Red Earl sheathed his cold grin. "No reinforcements," he said, voice low. "Fine by me." Charles allowed himself a faint smile in return. He thrived on opponents who could endure his might. His talent wasn't in delicate swordplay, but in sheer overpowering slashes. With a swift motion, he swept his arm across the clearing. Brilliant arcs of white energy sprang from his greatsword, cutting off the Red Earl's escape routes in a sparkling cage. Then, in a blur of motion, Charles rained down more than a dozen blows. Each strike was driven by his iron resolve, each winded arc carrying the full weight of his will. The Red Earl's eyes widened. He'd never seen sword energy unleashed so effortlessly, as natural as breathing, yet so devastatingly focused. To meet Charles's onslaught head-on now would be nothing short of suicide. The Red Earl summoned twin ribbons of blood-red energy, lashing out to intercept and shatter several of Charles's spectral blades. The remaining illusions winked out as he weaved aside, evading the dozen flying slashes and the blink of an eye, and then surged forward. He knew he had to force close-quarters combat. If he let Charles maintain his distance, that boy's relentless sword magic would eventually overwhelm him. He landed on light feet, closing the gap in 2 strides. He'd never faced an opponent with such seemingly endless reserves of stamina. "He's a monster," the Earl thought, sweat beading on his brow. Charles panted, cheeks flushed from the effort of unleashing so many slashes at once. Gritting his teeth, he met the Earl head-on, sweeping his blade in a vicious arc aimed at the Earl's chest. Clang! The Earl slammed his umbrella shut just in time, its steel rim absorbing the blow. In that instant, he caught Charles's stance, his grip, his rhythm, and adapted on the fly. With a deft pivot and a crack of steel, the Earl closed the final distance. His next assault came faster, each strike sharper than before. Caught off balance, Charles could only frantically parry as the Earl's relentless barrage drove him back, the advantage firmly in the Earl's hands. Chapter 62. The Red Earl's blade blurred faster and faster, each strike testing Charles's defenses. He winced at the way the Earl's umbrella sword probed for gaps, angles so precise that Charles scarcely had time to adjust. With every clash, his prized longsword vibrated violently, metal threading beginning to give way under the strain. Alarm bells rang in his mind. Don't break, don't break. He poured his martial aura into the hilt, willing the weapon to hold. A fierce glow ran along the blade as he brought it up in a flat, horizontal guard. Clang! The Earl's umbrella smashed against it, and for a heartbeat Charles thought he had held. Then came a sharp, final crack, click, and the sword snapped clean in two. Charles staggered, heart pounding, as steel fragments clattered to the ground. The Red Earl dropped his umbrella sword, taking a measured step back to appraise him. "Isn't that supposed to be a famous blade?" he asked coolly, eyebrows raised in mild surprise. Charles stared at the broken haft in his right hand, breathing hard. The Earl's challenge hung in the air. Swallowing his frustration, Charles lifted his gaze to meet the Earl's eyes. Then, with quiet determination, he simply nodded. Charles shook his head, a wry smile on his lips. "It's not some legendary blade," he said, "just a plain old longsword." The Red Earl arched a perfectly groomed eyebrow. He glanced at the pirate's bounty, 5 billion Baileys, and refused to believe a man of such notoriety would carry no famed weapon. "And yet you claim to own no sword of renown?" Charles shifted his weight, hiding his flush of embarrassment. Surely a seasoned swordsman would be prideful enough to wield a signature blade. "No," he admitted. "I've never had a so-called famous sword." "Then what of your black blade?" the Red Earl pressed, flicking open his parasol. Its polished spokes gleamed like riveted steel. "I've tried to forge one more than once," Charles explained, forcing cheer into his voice. "But between all the battles I've fought in the New World, I've never managed to complete it." The Red Earl snapped the parasol shut with a precise click. He studied Charles coolly. "If you cannot even arm yourself properly, any duel between us would be nothing more than bullying. Return when you have a true sword in hand, only then will I face you in combat." Charles bristled at the dismissal. "Wait, did you just say you'd be bullying me?" His hands curled into fists. Granted, he had no fabled blade, but he wouldn't be dismissed so easily. "Who do you think you are, daring to taunt me? And who says a shattered blade is worthless? Come on, let's go again." The Red Earl's sneer cut deep into Charles's pride. Clenching the broken sword in one hand, he refused to yield. Unbeknownst to them both, Wells had captured every word on his hidden recording bug. At Cyborg Kong's side, the android fighter watched with a twinge of regret. Both men were pirates, yes, but they were also among the world's few great swordsmen, and clashes of that caliber were almost unheard of. Yet the duel had already ended the moment Charles's blade splintered. Back at Navy headquarters, the news spread like wildfire. The fleet boasted plenty of brawny soldiers, but counted only a handful of true swordmasters, and none at the great swordsman level. Witnessing two such experts trade blows even briefly was an invaluable event. Commanders agreed that studying the encounter could spark new techniques and dramatically enhance a swordsman's combat power. They were already planning to archive Wells's footage for future officers and recruits to review and learn from. The tropical sun beat down on the deserted island as the Red Earl fixed Charles with a cold, contemptuous stare. Despite Charles's efforts at polite conversation, the Earl didn't take him seriously. After all, a swordsman whose blade was shattered hardly seemed a threat, even if rumors called him great. The Earl's indifference stung. Charles's chest tightened with anger. "You think this broken sword means nothing? I'll show you just how you are." Suddenly, a fierce determination flared in Charles's eyes. The air around him crackled with latent power, and the Red Earl's frown deepened. "What's he began, but couldn't finish. Without warning, a deep crimson aura burst from the jagged edge of Charles's blade. Lightning-red veins danced across the steel as Charles bellowed, "Blood Sword Badian!" In an instant, the fractured sword gleamed like molten blood. Charles braced himself, voice low and deadly. "Brace yourself." He sprang forward, unleashing a thunderous, scarlet-charged slash. Each pulse of energy echoed legends of Kaido's mighty thunderclap techniques and the hushed stories passed down through later generations. The Red Earl's eyes went wide with shock. Never before had he sensed such raw, life-threatening power in a single stroke. "I hadn't felt an excitement like this in years. The thrill of impending danger, the promise of a decisive clash. My heart thundered as I summoned my sword's red aura. Before me stood the Red Earl, his crimson eyes gleaming with anticipation. He laughed, sharp and metallic, echoing across the shore. "Ha ha! Threats of death, you say? How quaint." Drawing closer, I unleashed my power, a single, sweeping slash bathed in scarlet light. The Earl's sword, I called, the words torn from my lips by raw energy. The Red Earl planted his feet and met my attack head-on, his black umbrella opening with a crack of steel on steel. A deafening clang rang out as blade met iron. The force of the collision sent him hurtling more than 10 meters back, crashing onto the sand. But he sprang up again the moment he hit the ground, narrowing the distance between us in a single bound. He spat blood, dark rivulets staining his lips. For a heartbeat, he remained motionless before letting out a guttural laugh. "Ha! You actually drew blood!" He clutched his chest, eyes wide with both pain and exhilaration. "Remarkable, but what sorcery is this?" He pressed a hand against his tunic, where the embroidered roses over his heart glowed deeper red with each pulse of his life's blood. Even wounded, he stood tall, the red blossoms a vivid testament to his defiance. Between the roar of the waves and his strained laughter, I sensed this duel was only just beginning. The Red Earl didn't even register the faint crimson aura flickering around Charles's arm. All he could see was the wreckage of his own blade and the wild triumph in Charles's eyes. He felt at the moment that final slash landed, a power unlike anything he'd ever faced. Humiliation spread across the Red Earl's face, and Charles threw back his head, laughter ringing out. Ha! Who had dared to look down on him? With a single blow, Charles had shattered the Red Earl's sword into splinters, leaving nothing but a broken hilt. The Red Earl ground his teeth, trying in vain to peer into Charles's mind, to discover some hidden trick, and finding nothing. Gradually, Charles's laughter died away. He met the Red Earl's bewildered stare without flinching. There was no point in hiding what he'd done. The technique he'd just unleashed was known only to a select few in this new world, practitioners able to bend Overlord Chi itself. Charles had first encountered it during his duel with Ling Ling, and proving a natural talent, had mastered it in record time. "The move I just used," Charles said calmly, "is called Overlord's Chromatic Domination. It wraps my Overlord Chi in vibrant color and channels it through my weapon, exponentially increasing its cutting force. That's why your sword couldn't withstand a single strike." The Red Earl's eyes narrowed. Pride wounded, yet respect begrudgingly kindled in his chest. He tightened his grip on the hilt of his ruined blade, already plotting his next move. "You didn't see that coming, did you? The Overlord's chromatic key can even coat a weapon," Charles announced with a cocky grin. The Red Earl scowled at Charles's showboating. All he'd come for was instruction in this mysterious art, nothing more. Yet every time he opened his mouth to ask Ho, Charles's arrogant smirk shut him up. Finally, the Red Earl clenched his fists and swallowed his pride. He wouldn't beg a brat, no matter how powerful the technique might be. Charles spread his arms wide, unfazed. "So, want to learn? Just say the word, and I'll teach you everything." Chapter 63. The Tsundere Red Earl. Charles strode up to the brooding Red Earl, who still clutched his chest in subtle outrage. With exaggerated allure, Charles purred, "Such a shame you can't teach me, so I'll just have to go to the New World and learn it myself." The Earl's face darkened instantly. He swept out a gloved hand, shoving Charles aside. "Fine by me," he snapped. "Try finding anyone who can teach you. As far as I know, there are only 2 people in all the realms capable of such tyrannical power. If you do manage it, then maybe, just maybe, you'll learn something." Charles laughed, entirely unfazed by the Earl's dismissal. His voice dripped with teasing confidence as the Earl fell uncharacteristically silent, melancholy flickering in his eyes. That only egged Charles on. He threw back his head and laughed again, loud and scornful. "Ha!" The Red Earl's cheeks flushed crimson. With mounting fury, he lifted his ornate parasol, as if to jab it into Charles's smug expression. In an instant, Charles stifled his laughter. He reached into his coat, pulled out the battered practice notebook Locks had given him, and tore out 3 well-worn pages. Calmly, he held them out. The Earl hesitated, brow still tight with offended pride. Charles met his gaze evenly. "Here," he said softly, "proof that I've been studying, whether you believe in me or not." A tense moment passed as the Earl stared at the torn pages. Then, very quietly, his shoulders eased, the parasol lowered, pride warred with grudging respect in his eyes. Charles pocketed his smile. Whatever happened next, he knew this was only the beginning of a far grander journey into the New World. Charles tapped Ryder, the Red Earl, on the shoulder as he handed over the scroll. Ryder, this is the Overlord's entanglement cultivation method. It was written by Captain Locke himself, an incredibly rare treasure. Keep it safe. For once, Ryder didn't recoil at Charles's large hand. He leaned in, eyes fixed on the parchment. Charles studied him with a calm intensity. If you want to cultivate true dominance, there's no shortcut. You must spar with opponents who can match your strength. Only in battle will you ascend beyond your limits. Ryder looked up, eagerness shining in his dark eyes. So tell me, who in this world can challenge that kind of power? Charles smiled, amusement dancing at the corners of his mouth. Easy, Ryder. You're already impatient. Ryder frowned, perplexed by the laughter in Charles's voice. When Charles's smile faded, he quieted, then pointed a thumb at his own chest. The one who can stand toe-to-toe with you is right here. Ha! Charles laughed, even as the Red Earl's glare burned into him. When the Earl raised his umbrella in warning, Charles held up his hands. All right, no more jokes. He flicked his wrist, only to have his sword splinter into pieces, long, feathery shards fluttering to the ground. In a world like this, anyone with a domineering aura has to back it up with action. Hey, wait, don't be so hasty. With that, Charles vaulted to his feet and sprang aside. The Earl's blade struck the earth where he just stood, gouging out a crater. Stop spouting nonsense, or I'll get serious, Charles called out. The Red Earl's voice was cool, but his eyes betrayed no eagerness to kill. Then, inexplicably, he laughed. I'm just teasing. Lighten up, try smiling more. Charles grinned. Look, I've studied these so-called tyrants, and I'm convinced there are exactly 7 in the world. 5 sail under the Rock's Pirates banner, and 2 under the Roger Pirates. On the Rock side, you've got Rox D. Gibbick, Edward Newgate, Whitebeard himself, Golden Lion Shiki, Charlotte Linlin, and then me. On the Roger side are Brother D. Roger and Sir Baz Raleigh. Those 7, they've got true presence, real domineering auras. Beyond them, I've never heard of anyone else who measures up. He held up 4 fingers, then a 5th, tapping each one in turn. That's the list. No more, no less. The Red Earl froze when he learned that 5 of the 7 warlords were allied with the Rock's pirates. Even so, a fierce pride swelled in his chest. He believed himself the one true contender for the title of Pirate Overlord of the Rocks. After all, that name had echoed through the Grand Line's first half, and he felt he'd earned every bit of its fame. All right then, I'll take them on, one at a time, he declared, his eyes blazing with excitement. Far from frightened, he was impatient to prove his strength against the best. Charles stared at him in disbelief. Ryder, you're crazy. You really expect to challenge each of them on your own? Haven't you forgotten? They're pirates. They won't just stand there and parley. They'll strike at the first sign of weakness, and you don't even have a weapon. Before Ryder could respond, Charles lunged forward, feet barely skimming the deck. He unleashed the Navy's 6-style slash, 6 lightning-fast sweeps meant to cut down any target in their path. Yet each stroke rushed past Ryder, failing to land so much as a nick. A faint smile tugged at the corner of Ryder's mouth. He'd always been proud of his speed, but Charles moved like a phantom, matching every attack with uncanny reflexes. In that moment, the Red Earl realized that this young man might be far more than an unarmed ally, perhaps even a future rival. Admiral Steelbone Kong and Fleet Admiral Sengoku Crane, who had been quietly seated in the Navy office, stared at Charles in outright astonishment. As senior officers, they immediately recognized the maneuver he'd just used, the Navy's secret 6th-style technique, but they never dreamed a pirate could master it so completely. With a thunderous bang, Steelbone Kong slammed his fist on the desk. Blast you, Charles! You'll be hauled in by the city guard as soon as you set foot on land. He shot Sengoku a furious glare. Deploying our 6th style right under our noses, this is a direct insult to the Navy. Unfazed, the Red Earl snapped his umbrella shut with a calm chuckle. Easy there, Admiral. No need to get yourself all riled up. Charles strolled forward, a grin playing at his lips, and gave the Red Earl a friendly pat on the shoulder. If you're looking for a real test, I've got one for you. Seek out the Roger Pirates. They're nothing like the cutthroat crews you're used to. You'll find them surprising. At the mention of Roger's name, Charles felt a flicker of excitement. It had been 7 years since he first entered the Grand Line. Yet he'd never actually encountered the famed Pirate King, only read about him in scattered news reports. Roger? The Red Earl lifted an eyebrow, considering Charles's words. Then he nodded decisively. All right, let's pay the Roger pirates a visit. Charles stood beside the Red Earl on the sun-baked shore and shouted, When we reach the New World, I'll be the first to challenge Roger himself. Whoa, 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 Charles hurriedly backpedaled. I meant Sir Baz Raleigh, the Roger Pirates' vice-captain, not Roger. I didn't say I'd take on the Pirate King. The Red Earl let out an arrogant snort. Who you decide to challenge is your own affair, he replied dismissively. Charles froze, taken aback by the Earl's blunt indifference. Then he scratched the back of his neck and laughed awkwardly. Right, of course. The Red Earl's lips twitched into something like amusement. He clapped Charles on the shoulder. Enough idle talk. Let's get moving. This beach won't feed us. I'm heading to the capital of Seven Waters for a proper meal. Charles fell into step beside him, and they strolled across the gleaming sand toward the gently lapping surf. 100 meters out, a small blue skiff bobbed on the waves. A lone figure stood at its bow, Den Den Mushi held to his ear. On the beach, Rear Admiral Wells raised his own Den Den Mushi. Ryder, looks like your bounty's about to climb again, he crackled over the line. Charles shot a sidelong glance at the Admiral, then smirked. Is that so? Together, they left the beach behind, each lost in thoughts of future challenges and rising bounties as the afternoon sun dipped toward the horizon. I couldn't care less about that, the Red Earl sneered, curling his lip in disdain. Charles merely shrugged. It was just a bit of fun. Bruce passed out the moment we unleashed our full force. He glanced down at the two Bruces sprawled on the beach, foam at their lips. Looks like that was more than they could handle, he remarked coolly. Chapter 64, A Race to the Seven Waters Capital. How about a little swimming contest? Charles asked, draping an arm over the Red Earl's shoulder as they stood on the sunlit shore. First one to reach the capital of Seven Waters gets to pick the next round of drinks. The sea between them and the distant port was no small stretch, but both men were famed for their strength in the water. The Red Earl shot a quick glance at Blue, foaming at the mouth with impatience, and reluctantly nodded. All right, Charles. On my count, 1, 2, 3, go. Charles dove in without hesitation, powerful strokes sending him cutting through the sparkling waves. The Red Earl shrugged off his reserve, tucked his parasol under one arm, and plunged in after him. Their arms churned like twin pistons, leaving white wakes behind them. Bruce! Bruce, wake up! Wake up! On a nearby skiff, Wells shook his crewmate until the young sailor's eyes fluttered open. Wells had been so caught up in cheering that he'd forgotten his own boat was drifting aimlessly. He gripped the rail, watching Charles pull ahead of the Red Earl. Pride and anxiety warred in his chest. Pride at his captain's effortless lead, anxiety for what the outcome might mean when they all finally reached the city. Charles and the Red Earl's gunboats bore down on Major General Wells's tiny lifeboat as he drifted helplessly in the open sea. Back in the Admiralty War Room, Steelbone Sora and Admiral Sengoku watched the live feed with mounting anxiety. Wells, abandon ship! Get out of there! Sora barked into the bugged comlink. He couldn't bear to see his friend perish. In the lifeboat, Wells fumbled with the oars. The little craft spun in tight circles as dark clouds scudded overhead. Through the crackling radio, he heard Sora's urgency, but the boat wouldn't heed his strokes. A sudden roar of engines and the thunder of cannon fire snapped Wells's heart into his throat. The two enemy launches, helmed by Charles and the Red Earl, were closing fast. He froze, gripping the sides of the boat, bracing himself for the end. Crash! Crash! Shot after shot splintered the water inches from his hull. There was no escape, or so he thought. Closing his eyes, he waited for the final blow. Then, splashes. Two rapid bursts of paddles cut through the waves on either side of him. Wells's breath caught. Seconds stretched into eternity, and then the paddles fell silent. Hey! I'm not dead, he gasped, trembling as he pushed himself upright. He ran a hand over his body, half expecting blood, but found only unbroken skin. You didn't kill me? He stammered into his radio. Back at the Admiralty, Sora let out a long, shuddering exhale. Sengoku's stern face cracked into relief. He's alive, Sengoku muttered. Suddenly, a thunderous bang echoed through the war room speakers. a warning shot aimed squarely at Charles's launch. Sora leaned forward, voice low and fierce. "Damn brat," he growled. "You're way too arrogant if you think you could off Major General Wells." The feed went black. Somewhere offshore, the littoral gunboats spat fire in the night, but for now, Wells was safe, and Sora and Sengoku had sent a clear message. No one harmed their people with impunity. "You really don't take our Navy seriously, do you?" Cyborg Kong's voice crackled with disbelief. He couldn't fathom how Charles had not only uncovered Wells's true mission as a naval observer, but was treating the whole affair like a joke. It felt like a direct challenge to the fleet. Off to one side, John Guo and he exchanged knowing glances. Each saw the wry smile curling the other's lips. They both understood that tensions were mounting, but for now, their attention was riveted on a very different contest. Out on the open water, Charles and the Red Earl were locked in a blistering duel. From afar, their synchronized strokes carved twin wakes through the sea's glassy surface. Charles held a slender lead, just half a body's length ahead, while the Red Earl strained every muscle, surging to close the gap. He suspected Charles of Delhi, berately pacing himself, savoring the thrill of the pursuit. In what felt like the blink of an eye, they'd covered most of the course. Now came the decisive moment, the final sprint. Without a word, both swimmers summoned every ounce of power left in their limbs. Charles's strong, efficient strokes drove him forward, each movement precise and unstoppable. The Red Earl matched him blow for blow, churning whitecaps in his wake. Neither showed a shred of hesitation or fatigue as they fought for supremacy. The sea trembled beneath their effort. Foam sprayed in plumes, the only evidence of their fierce contest. And as the shoreline drew nearer, both contenders prepared for the burst that would determine the victor and settle this race once and for all. The sun hung low over the Seven Waters capital, casting a warm glow on the restless sea. From the shoreline, townsfolk peered out to where two dark shapes churned through the surf. "Look," someone cried. "What's that out there?" A hush fell. Then a sharper voice, "They're swimming, fast." Skeptics shook their heads. No way two people could cut through the water like that. But as the figures closed the distance, the crowd's disbelief turned to awe. In moments, the pair burst through the final breakers, surging up the beach toward the cheering onlookers. With a triumphant gasp, Charles hauled himself onto the sand a hair's breadth ahead of his rival, the Red Earl. He threw back his head, laughter bubbling up. "Ha, Earl Red, you lose!" The Red Earl's face darkened with irritation as he waded in. He sputtered, "Rematch. No, wait, treat." Charles grinned and clapped the Earl on the shoulder. "All right, you choose the tavern. I'm buying." The Red Earl opened his mouth to protest, but, defeated and dripping wet, could do little more than manage a begrudging chuckle. "Very well, lead the way." And with that, the two soaked swimmers strode off the beach, ready to celebrate, or commiserate, the outcome of their impromptu race. Charles's lips curved into a mocking smile as the Red Earl's threat echoed in the narrow street. "Is that so?" Charles drawled. "By all means, try and see who really has the last laugh." The Earl's eyes flashed with fury. He wasn't the type to give up easily. Around them, a handful of grizzled sailors, slave traders by their twisted trade, watched with leering interest. From their furtive glances and the faint metallic jingle of chains, Charles could tell they meant to capture them both and sell them off to the Tianlong. The thought made the Earl's face contort in disgust, but he ignored it and fell into step behind Charles. With every footstep, Charles seemed to know exactly where he was going. The winding lanes of the Seven Waters capital were as familiar to him as the lines on his palm. Onlookers whispered and craned their necks, but Charles brushed past them as if they were nothing more than scenery. Finally, he halted before a dimly lit tavern whose weather-beaten sign creaked in the sea breeze. The Red Earl hesitated at the threshold. Only now did he realize why all his mind-reading spells had failed him. Charles's thoughts were utterly sealed off from magic. A flutter of relief passed through the Earl. No one could peer into his plans either, but it left behind a sting of frustration. He had hoped to unravel Charles's motives, to learn what the boy was plotting. Yet as Charles pushed open the tavern door and vanished into its smoky interior, the Earl knew he would have to rely on old-fashioned cunning from here on out. Charles led the Red Earl down the broad avenue at the heart of the Seven Rivers capital. The street teemed with life, vendors hawking exotic spices, children chasing stray dogs, and noble families in carriages rolling past bustling stalls. Charles's eyes glowed at the spectacle. He'd never felt more alive. But the Red Earl's face grew steadily more sullen. He caught sight of overturned barrels oozing muddy water, wagon wheels spattered with refuse, and ragged beggars weaving through the crowd. Every grisly detail churned his stomach. Charles noticed the Earl's tightening jaw and hastened his steps. Following his nose, he guided the Earl around a corner and into a narrow alley where the warm scent of aged oak barrels and spiced fruits drifted out onto the street. "This way," Charles urged. "You'll like it." They emerged before a squat, timber-framed building with a swinging lantern above the door. A carved sign read Anchor Tavern in bold, gilded letters. Charles grinned. "Here we are." The Red Earl paused outside, hesitating. He pressed a hand to his chest, as though steadying himself against a wave of revulsion, then sighed and allowed Charles to draw him inside. Charles threw open the heavy oak door with a single kick. A blast of laughter, clinking mugs, and rich wine aromas greeted them. The Red Earl cast a weary glance at the bustling common room. Smoke curling from lanterns, grizzled sailors arguing in hushed tones, and a bard tuning a lute in the corner. He could almost hear his own heart pounding. Charles pushed past him and shouted over the din, "Boss! A table for two, and something strong, please!" The Red Earl followed reluctantly, already dreading the evening's charge to his dignity and his purse. "I'd be happy to help. Please provide the rest of the chapter text you'd like rewritten, and I'll transform it into a polished, coherent English version with Charles as the male protagonist." Chapter 65, Arrest. The heavy oak door swung open, and the Red Earl, Ryder, stepped into the tavern, his boots splattering mud on the floorboards. He nearly lost his balance when he heard young Charles speak up so boldly. A dark shadow passed over Ryder's face. He'd met his share of shameless types, but none quite like this. Clearing his throat loudly, the Earl made sure everyone in the room knew he was there. Charles jumped to his feet, cheeks flushing, and hastily pulled out a chair. "Ha! Earl Ryder, you simply must join me for a drinking contest later." Ryder arched an eyebrow, studying Charles over the rim of his teacup. He eased into the offered seat with the air of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Isn't someone remarkably courageous, or perhaps foolhardy, to challenge an earl? I seem to recall you're only 20 years old." Charles blinked, caught off guard. 20? What are you implying?" The Earl waved a hand dismissively. "Nothing serious. It's just entertaining to outdrink a 20-year-old, especially when victory is guaranteed." A slow, mocking smile curled Ryder's lips. Charles's fist slammed down on the table, rattling the pewter mugs. He drew a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. "Careful, Ryder. Didn't someone just lose to a 20-year-old last week?" A hush fell over the tavern. Ryder leaned forward, eyes cold and assessing. "Is that so, miss?" "Charles Hawke," Charles replied, meeting the Earl's gaze without flinching. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Ryder's lips curved into a mocking grin. "Very well, Mr. Hawke. Consider the challenge accepted." Suddenly, both the Red Earl and Charles burst into laughter, their voices echoing through the tavern and freezing the boisterous crowd in mid-swig. They exchanged a knowing look, as if sharing a private joke, and the puzzled patrons gaped at them in bewilderment. A drunken brawler, enraged by the interruption, slammed his tankard on the table. "What's so funny?" he snarled, rising to his feet, fist clenched and ready to strike. But before he could lash out, Charles and the Earl moved as one. Charles drew a dagger that flashed white in the lamplight, while the Red Earl snapped open his umbrella to reveal a razor-sharp blade hidden inside. In a single, fluid motion, they struck. Charles's dagger severed the arm the drunkard had raised, clean through at the elbow. At the same instant, the Earl's umbrella sword carved a deep, red line from the man's waist to his chest. Agony shattered the brawler's drunken stupor. He collapsed to the floor with a bone-chilling crack. Silence fell over the tavern. Conversation died on every lip as the patrons realized they had just witnessed lethal skill and made a swift judgment about the pair's danger. Without another word, the room emptied in a stampede toward the door. Outside, one terrified voice echoed into the night. "He killed him! He's killed him!" The tavern erupted into chaos. Patrons bolted for the exits, their terrified screams reverberating off the walls. A few braver souls froze at the doorway, staring in horror at a fallen giant slumped in a widening pool of blood. "He's killed him!" No one dared linger for a second glance. Within moments, the room was nearly deserted. Only Charles, known far and wide as the Red Earl of the Crimson River, remained seated at the bar, a thin smile tugging at his lips. His companion, leaning in close, echoed his mirth with a low chuckle. They laughed in unison. "Ha! Ha!" Charles slapped his hand down on the rough wooden counter. "Oi, barkeep, where's my wine? Get it here, or I'll break your legs." Behind the bar, the tavern owner shrank back, eyes wide with panic. He dared not meet Charles's gaze, but forced himself forward, clutching a tray laden with 2 dusty bottles. His hands trembled so violently that the bottles clinked together. "Ye your wine, my lord," he stammered, voice quivering. As the barkeep set the tray before them, the dying man's faint, gurgling cough cut through the heavy silence, a grim reminder of the carnage that had just unfolded. Charles threw back his head and laughed uproariously. He grabbed one of the wine bottles from the table and handed it to the Red Earl, then uncorked the second with a swift twist of his wrist. "Come on, cheers! It's dull just sitting here," he challenged, raising the bottle. Clink! The Earl matched him, glass to glass. Glug, glug, glug. The two of them drained their bottles in one furious gulp. With a mighty crash, Charles smashed his empty bottle on the floor and stamped down on the shards. "Now that's thrilling." He looked up, his long blonde hair sweeping back from his face. "Fetch me every last bottle you've got." To the tavern keeper he called. "Hurry up, bring it all." The proprietor recoiled. Charles's presence was overwhelming, yet he scurried away and soon returned with a dozen more bottles of finest wine. Undeterred, Charles and the Red Earl began pouring and toasting again as if nothing had happened. Just then, a thunderous pounding came from the door. A herald's voice rang through the room. "What's this outrage? Someone has been slain in broad daylight here in the capital of 7 rivers. Who dares such a brazen crime? Sheriff, seize him at once." The proclamation was delivered by Mayor Hoyle himself, the hidden patron of every corrupt faction in the capital. Yet inside the tavern, Charles and the Earl raised their glasses once more, unfazed by the mayor's fury, as the clamor of approaching lawmen drew ever nearer. A shout echoed down the hallway. "The mayor's arrived!" The magistrate snapped to attention, bowing respectfully before barking orders to his assistants. They sprinted toward the murder scene, but by the time they reached it, they were too late. Meanwhile, at the Red Earl's riverside estate, a very different contest was underway. Lord Charles and the Red Earl sat across from one another, each gripping a bottle of wine like a prize. Neither would concede. "Here's my bottle," Charles declared, cheeks flushed. "Drink up." Without a word, the Red Earl raised his flask and drained it in one go, slamming the empty bottle on the table. "Ha! Finished mine first. I win." His triumphant laugh echoed off the walls until a sudden thud announced his collapse, head falling forward onto the polished wood. Charles threw back his head in victory. "You're out. That's another win for me." But before he could savor the moment, he too pitched forward, unconscious. Silence settled over the room, broken only by the soft scuffle of footsteps behind a swinging kitchen door. In the dim back kitchen, a small group of men stirred. These were the same mercenaries who'd spied the two lords at the riverbank earlier, waiting for their chance. One burly man in a grease-stained vest leaned close to their leader. "Boss," he whispered, voice low, "they've both passed out. How much did they drink?" As the others closed in, the knight's true purpose began to unfold. The boss, his face marked by a scorpion tattoo, stood silent for a moment, smoke curling from the cigarette between his fingers. Finally, he exhaled and spoke coolly. "Collar them, then ship them straight to the Seven Waters Capital auction. Let's see how much we can get." "Right away, boss," answered the 4 younger ruffians, members of the slave-catching squad that prowled the outskirts of the capital's auction house. They wasted no time. 2 of them seized Charles and the famed Red Earl, Patrick Redfield, snapping heavy iron collars around their necks. The moment the clasps tightened, the men relaxed. This haul was worth a small fortune. One of the enforcers, Jack, kicked at the Red Earl's side. "Still strutting your pride, dog?" Jack jeered. Another slaver snarled to hold him back. "Hey, watch it, Jack. That's the notorious pirate, Red Earl Patrick Redfield. 100 million Bailey's bounty on his head. You rough him up now. We'll lose half the profit. Jack scowled as his comrades yanked him away. Humph, I'll let him off easy this time, he muttered, dusting off his boots. If he falls into those nobles' hands, we'll be in real trouble. Jack spat. Those aristocrats are all perverts, and the Red Earl's dignified air and icy demeanor are exactly what they drool over. A distant clip-clop of hooves sounded. In an instant, half a dozen guards hoisted the unconscious Red Earl and Charles onto their shoulders and sprinted toward the auction house. Chapter 66, The Slave Traders. The two newcomers were done for. Those jackals had them in their clutches at last. Quiet, hissed one of the slave catchers, glancing furtively around the crowded market lane. You don't want to end up like them, do you? Is that what you want? Death? His companion stifled a reply behind a trembling hand, eyes darting toward the fruit stalls where 6 or 7 of their comrades were loading 2 bound figures onto a rickety cart. Thankfully, the traders were too fixated on their captives to notice the whispered exchange. The first man released a breath he didn't know he'd been holding and shot his friend a look of pure warning. Keep your mouth shut about this, he snapped. You're tempting fate, stirring trouble with these slave traders. If they catch wind, you're talking. That's an auction block for you. And besides, those two don't strike me as villains. Good folk don't murder for sport. A cold sweat broke across the second man's forehead. He pressed a finger to his lips and fell silent. Unaware of the danger, Charles and the Red Earl lay slumped in the cart, guiltless and still fast asleep. They hadn't stirred when the ropes were tightened or when they were hoisted aboard. It would be many minutes, if not hours, before either man came to. 10 minutes later, the murmurs of the market were cut short by the sharp click of boots on cobblestone. A troop of sheriffs, gold-trimmed uniforms gleaming in the afternoon sun, marched into the alleyway, halting at the fruit stalls. Their captain, a stern-faced woman with a steel badge pinned to her chest, surveyed the scene. Overturned crates, discarded ropes, and the slave traders frozen in place, caught between flight and confrontation. Raising her voice, she barked an order to her men, and the air crackled with tension. Charles and the Red Earl had no idea that deliverance was on its way. But fate, it seemed, had finally turned in their favor. As they stepped into the tavern, every peace officer trained their muskets on the door. The peace chief from the mayor's office blew his horn and bellowed, "Murderer inside! Surrender at once, hands on your head, and beg for mercy." No one answered, except the tavern owner himself, who stumbled out with his hands clasped over his head. "Boss! Boss! Don't shoot!" he cried. "I'm the proprietor." The two fugitives were already taken by Keeban's men. The innkeeper's frantic explanation hung in the chilly air. The security captain's face went pale. He knew Keeban well, the notorious leader of the slave-hunting squad outside the Seven Waters Capital auction house. Under Keeban's command was a full detachment of slave catchers, and the auction house's secret patron was none other than Mayor Hoyle, the security captain's immediate superior. He realized the bind at once. Spinning on his heel, he faced the 20-odd guards assembled behind him and shouted, "Stand down! Break ranks and fall back!" In tense silence, the officers lowered their weapons and dispersed, leaving the tavern's door unguarded, at least for now. "Damn bad luck," the sheriff spat as he turned his horse, motioning his men to follow. They'd ridden all the way out for nothing. Now he'd have to fetch the mayor and let him decide what to do next. Inside the auction house's back room, G-Ben's laughter echoed off the timber walls. "Manager Fay, feast your eyes on today's catch." At his command, 2 burly attendants dragged in the dazed forms of the Red Earl of Xiaoluohe and a rugged soldier named Corbin, both reeking of strong drink. Manager Fay's eyes narrowed. "Only 2? You know the rule. If we don't meet the quota, our merchandise ends up on the block too." He leaned in, voice low and threatening. "Just hold on a moment," G-Ben said, stepping forward with an oily grin. Before the manager could react, G-Ben casually slipped a handful of gleaming gold tokens, Bailey's, into Fay's coat pocket. Manager Fay checked the weight of the coins, a satisfied smile creeping across his face. "Very well, prepare them properly. This fellow," he nodded at the Red Earl, "is quite the prize. He'll turn a handsome profit. You're bidding 300 million Baileys, and that boy over there only offered 80 million. Think you can fool anyone? Young or old, we all see through that. Manager Fai's sharp voice cut through the murmurs. That's enough. Everybody listen up. G-Ben's hands came together in a greedy clap. Perfect. Take me backstage so I can get the payment ready. Manager Fai led him through a maze of corridors to the auction house's rear courtyard. Rows of iron cages, some large, some small, lined the walls. Inside each was a human figure, eyes glazed over, staring blankly ahead. These were not animals for sale, but people under a dark spell. Use these 2 cages, Manager Fai said, pointing to a pair of blood-streaked enclosures. Lock them both up there. G-Ben nodded and motioned to his younger brother. With a grunt, the man hauled the captive known as the Red Earl into the first cage, then shoved Charles into the second. The clatter of iron bars snapping shut echoed through the yard. Excellent, Manager Fai said, satisfaction gleaming in his eyes. He waved dismissively. Go on, pay up. Eager to finalize the deal, G-Ben followed Manager Fai into a lavish office. The manager swung open a hidden safe and withdrew a neat stack of bills. Precisely 380 million Baileys changed hands. G-Ben glanced at the now empty vault as Manager Fai snapped it shut, sealing the transaction and their victim's fate. Inside the vault lay hundreds of millions of Baileys in cash and a handful of gold bars. Caben's eyes glittered with greed, but he dared not let it show. Manager Fai lounged in the boss's chair, exhaled a plume of smoke from his cigar, and said, Here, it's all yours. And remember this month's slave quota. Deliver every last one, or you'll be the one up for auction. G-Ben snapped to attention and nodded vigorously. Yes, sir. I'll see that the full number is delivered. Manager Fai waved him off. G-Ben's backed out of the auction hall, and no sooner had he cleared the threshold than 6 or 7 of his younger lieutenants swarmed around him. Boss, how much did you pay this time? One asked, eyes shining. G-Ben's cast a scornful look back at the auction house and snorted. 380 million Baileys. They wouldn't budge an inch. He spat on the ground. 380? That's barely enough for a round of drinks. His underlings grumbled at the steep price, but G-Ben's just shook his head in frustration. Boss, didn't you tell Manager Fai that one of our captives is that notorious pirate with a 100 million bounty? His younger brother asked, frowning. G-Ben slapped his palm against his forehead. Damn it, I totally forgot. That old coot handed me something unbelievable the moment we boarded, and I got completely sidetracked. His brother sighed. Well, we're out of luck this round. Let's drown our sorrows at the tavern. Once we've sobered up, we split up and hunt for better slaves. We still have 3 slave share quotas left this month. If you don't want them credited under my name, keep your eyes peeled for top-quality catches. G-Ben's glare was sharp. Understood. His men exchanged nervous looks. They all knew their boss would hold them to that. With subdued grumbles, they fell in line behind Kaido, who was lugging a heavy crate toward the rickety tavern by the docks. Behind them, in a grimy iron cage, the Red Earl of Jialuhe lay sprawled on the floor, snoring so loudly it sounded like an anchor chain being dragged across cobblestone. In the bleak confines of the slave pens, even the strongest hearts began to crumble. Quiet sobs. Wah! Wah! Rippling through the rows of cells quickly grew into a chorus of despair. Wah! For long minutes, the prison was filled with nothing but sorrowful cries, punctuated by the harsh clang of iron bars as weary captives beat against their cages. Chapter 67. The Breath of Despair. Stop crying. If you don't, I'll have no choice but to sell you off. The burly man in dirty overalls slammed an iron rod against the bars of the cage. His face twisted with cruel satisfaction as the clangs echoed through the dim, cavernous room. At once, the other captives, children huddled together on the cold stone floor, pressed trembling hands to their mouths, stifling their sobs. Pleased by their sudden silence, the guard turned his scowl toward one lone sleeper in the corner. His boots crunched on scattered straw as he approached the iron enclosure. Inside, Charles lay curled up, breathing evenly, utterly untroubled by the guard's threats or the misery around him. Wake up, you little brat, the man snarled, jabbing the bars again. Why the hell are you sleeping? You think you're better than the rest of us. Labor doesn't get to rest. Clang! Clank! The guard struck the bars repeatedly, but Charles remained oblivious. A single thin snore slipped from the boy's lips. Irritated, the guard bared his teeth. You insolent! He clenched his rod tighter, his knuckles whitening. Looking down at Charles, he spat on the cage floor. "Fine, you can sleep your life away, but don't come crying to me when they come to take you." With that, he turned on his heel, the iron rod tucked under his arm. The other children held their breath until his boots faded into the shadows. Only then did they exhale, casting anxious glances at the sleeping boy whose fate was as uncertain as their own. In the sudden hush, Charles's chest rose and fell in peaceful rhythm. But beneath that calm exterior, the breath of despair stirred, promising that even the sweetest sleep might soon be shattered by cruel reality. "You want to die, don't you?" Jonah snarled, sliding the iron rod through the bars of the cage and thrusting it at Charles. He jabbed at the boy's face, then struck at his stomach, hard and without mercy. Yet Charles remained unmoved. He simply snored, curled in the corner of the cell. Jonah's anger boiled over. He swung the rod again and again, hollering, "Wake up, you bastard!" Every tense muscle in the warehouse watched him, terrified that his fury might turn on them next. Suddenly a voice rang out from beyond the open doors. "Jonah, Chief Fei is here. Get moving." At that, Jonah paused. With a final spiteful glare at Charles, he dropped the rod and stormed out. The others exhaled in relief, as though freed from a vice. But the calm didn't last. Seconds after Jonah's retreat, a soft sob turned into a keening cry from the back of the warehouse. One by one, the frightened laborers joined in, their tears and wails filling the cavernous room until it echoed with sorrow. Charles, still deep in sleep, suddenly furrowed his brow as though caught in a nightmare. A soft hum escaped his lips, just a single, eerie note that sent a ripple of fear through the other captives. None of them had forgotten the overseer's brutal beatings. Even the faintest sound could set their hearts pounding. Yet Charles merely shifted, found a more comfortable position, and drifted back into slumber. Next to him, the Red Earl lay just as peacefully, but with a grace that marked him as nobility. His posture was impeccable, his breathing steady and untroubled. In that dim, musty warehouse, only these two seemed so utterly out of place among the broken and the beaten. Jonah stepped into Manager Fei's cramped office, bowed low, and said, "You wanted to see me, Master Fei?" Manager Fei gestured to a wooden desk piled with papers. "Good. Take this list. Those are the slaves we'll auction off tomorrow. The bidders will be princes and nobles. Even the mayor plans to attend. Don't let us lose our reputation over shoddy goods." Jonah took the parchment and scanned it quickly. Each captive was identified only by a number. "Number 98 and 99, he murmured. "Those two are Charles and the Red Earl." A sharp smile flickered across Manager Fei's face. "Exactly. Make sure they're presentable. Tomorrow, the highest bidder will walk off with them." Jonah unfolded the list and matched each number to its corresponding iron cage. He skimmed the entries, then looked up with a forced grin. "All set. Don't worry. I'll make sure everything's in order." Manager Fei returned the smile and waved him off. "Very well. You're dismissed." Jonah gave a polite nod, slipped out of the office, and eased the door closed behind him. Once he was alone in the corridor, he let out a long breath. Now came the real work, touring each of the 100 cages, confirming that every slave slated for tomorrow's auction was alive and accounted for. Clipboard in hand, he began at cage number 1. The first 97 were routine, pale faces behind iron bars, silently waiting. At cage 98, he stopped dead. The figure curled inside had sparked his anger earlier. Charles. The boy lay curled in a corner, still asleep despite the cold, hard floor. Jonah's lips twitched in a sneer. "Enjoy your rest," he muttered under his breath. "Tomorrow's your first day as someone else's property." Without another word for Charles, he moved on and finished his inspection. Satisfied that all 100 captives were present, Jonah strode out of the warehouse with a self-satisfied hum. As the warehouse doors swung shut, its cavernous interior settled into silence, broken only by the soft, frightened sobs of those who would soon be sold. The warehouse was oppressively still, its air thick with a long-buried sorrow that pressed down on every surface. Even as Charles lay unconscious on the cold concrete, his brow creased in distress, betraying the nightmare unfolding behind his eyelids. He'd always been acutely sensitive to the emotions of those around him, once a crippling weakness, then with age, something he could usually keep in check. But here, the silent despair of everyone trapped inside had finally crashed through his defenses, poisoning his sleep with echoes of wailing and grief. In his dream, Charles was surrounded by shadowy figures whose cries of hopelessness reverberated in his chest. He turned and twisted beneath his blanket, but there was no escaping their anguish. Drunk and exhausted, he could only suffer in restless silence. Outside, Rear Admiral Wells paced the dim corridor. He'd waited for Blue to stir, and once the signal came, he ordered him back to shore at once. Then, swallowing his pride, Wells keyed the hatchcom and spoke into the crackling comlink. "Steelbone General," he began, voice tight with shame. I'm sorry. I've lost Charles." He paused, hoping fervently that this confession wouldn't be the end of him, but he'd find Charles, no matter what. In the Admiral's office at Navy headquarters, Cyborg Kong frowned as he listened to the bugged phone. When the report ended, he spoke in a low, steely voice. "Understood. If you carry on with the surveillance, your safety comes first. Do not approach Charles, keep your distance, and observe silently." Cyborg Sora inclined her head, slipping the bugged handset under her arm. Wells said nothing as Kong hung up. The hard part was just beginning. Without knowing Charles's location, they couldn't monitor him at all. Since this was a covert operation, Wells dared not question people openly. His only option was a painstaking, street-by-street sweep. For hours, 30-plus plainclothes Marines fanned out across the city. Wells even halted each squad to ask if they'd seen Charles, but every answer was the same: no sightings. The small band of pirates trailing Charles didn't matter, only finding Charles himself did. By nightfall, the city had grown dark, and the search had turned up nothing. "Where are you going?" Wells wondered as he sat outside the tea house, flanked by more than 30 of his subordinates. Chapter 68, The Auction. "Your Excellency, Rear Admiral." A plainclothes naval captain approached Captain Wells with a quiet urgency. "We've intercepted a report. Tomorrow, the capital of Seven Waters will hold its monthly auction. Do you think the pirate Charles will show up?" Wells set down his teacup, his interest piqued. He'd already noticed the colorful banners strung across the city announcing the auction. It made perfect sense that Charles, ever drawn to high-stakes gatherings, would attend. "I'd bet on it," Wells said, a spark of excitement in his eyes. Without warning, he slammed his palm on the table. "Prepare the fleet. At first light tomorrow, we move on the auction house." The sudden outburst drew several officers' attention, but Wells was quick to resume his composed demeanor. He lifted his cup in a casual gesture, as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened. His real directive was clear: maintain utmost discretion. Track Charles without alerting him to our presence. The next morning, the capital of Seven Waters stirred with life. Merchants, nobles, and adventurers thronged the streets, all eager for the monthly auction's treasures, and unaware that a naval armada lay in wait, ready to pounce on a notorious pirate at the heart of the spectacle. The broad avenues of the Seven Streams capital were alive with the glittering processions of princes and nobles, each flanked by a cluster of stony-faced guards. Major General Wells stepped into the grand auction house, his escort trailing behind him. Not a single doorman challenged them, an oversight that made Wells flush with embarrassment. All his painstaking preparations, it seemed, had been for nothing. "Your Excellency," murmured the colonel at his side, "we have our invitations. Simply present them, and no one will question us." He spoke with a disdainful lift of his brow, an arrogance that did not go unnoticed. A few passing noblewomen offered coquettish smiles and fluttering fans in response. Wells cleared his throat. "Remember why we're here. We're not collecting curiosities tonight. We're hunting the pirate known as Charles." The colonel's lips curved into a quick nod. Before Wells could reply, a well-dressed attendant approached. "Major General, Colonel, welcome. The auction is about to begin. If you'll follow me, your private viewing room awaits." Wells exchanged a wary glance with his deputy. A private room, he thought, when the whole city is crammed with buyers and bidders? Something about this felt too effortless. Still, he followed the attendant down a silent corridor, determined to keep sight of their true prize. Wells unfolded the heavy cardstock and frowned at the embossed seal. It was an invitation to a private viewing room, exactly what he'd been hunting for. When Colonel Macaulay caught his cautious glance, he couldn't suppress a triumphant grin. "I knew you'd be surprised," the colonel crowed softly. I found a black market broker last night and paid nearly 1,000,000 pile for this. Wells raised an eyebrow. 1,000,000 pile? Macaulay nodded, feigning a pained wince. Wells's lips twitched. Return to Navy headquarters, he said, and I'll reimburse you. Once the waiter had bowed and slipped away, Wells turned back to Macaulay without even glancing at the ornate decor. His mission weighed on him far more heavily than any auction treasure. Find Charles. And so far, the young cadet seemed to have vanished. He swept the crowded room with purposeful eyes. Wealthy patrons in tailored suits huddled around display cases, whispering bids. Shimmering art pieces and jewels sat under glass domes, but Charles was nowhere in sight. Wells's unease grew into impatience. He rose from his seat, straightened his jacket, and stepped toward the doorway. "Major General Macaulay," he called, voice taut. The colonel snapped to attention. "Yes, sir?" Wells squared his shoulders. "Keep your ear to the ground. I'm going back out there. If Charles is here, I will find him." Macaulay saluted stiffly. "At once, sir." Wells gave him a curt nod, then slipped back into the main hall. Each footstep echoing on the marble floor reminded him how critical time had become. Somewhere among these wealthy bidders and shadowy dealers, Charles was waiting, maybe even in danger, and Wells was resolved not to leave without him. "Let's wait a little longer," the colonel suggested, brows creased with concern. "The auction hasn't started yet. People are still arriving." Wells hid his frustration behind a calm expression and took a seat beside him. Yesterday, the colonel had confidently predicted that Charles would turn up at this very auction house. Yet now, with the sale about to begin and no sign of him, the colonel looked unsettled. Moments later, a small ladder appeared from the roof, and the auctioneer descended gracefully onto the stage. The prearranged crowd, an energetic team of audience boosters, erupted in synchronized cheers. "Ooh, ah!" they called out in unison. Wells frowned at the cacophony. He scanned the rows of seats madly, searching for any hint of Charles's tall figure. But there was nothing. "Ladies and gentlemen," boomed the auctioneer's voice once he reached the podium. "Welcome to the Seven Water Capital Auction. I'm your host, Dudu, and I'll be guiding you through today's event." Instantly, more applause rang out, again courtesy of the auction house's hired clappers, blunting any awkward silence as the real bidders settled in. Yet despite the lively atmosphere, Wells's gaze never wavered from the entrance, hoping Charles would appear at any moment. Major General Wells rose from his seat, the official dispatch crumpling in his hand. "Your Majesty, Major General, have we forgotten the crate? Could that Charles be inside it?" As Wells started toward the exit, Colonel Hart caught his sleeve. "Sir, please, wait." Hart's suggestion stopped him cold. It was unnerving to think the boy might be concealed within one of the auction's private booths. Wells exhaled, turned back, and sat heavily. Before him stretched 20 curtained chambers along the rear of the auction stand. Only their opening would reveal if Charles lay hidden in any of them. With a resigned nod, Wells settled in. He'd have to wait and watch. Meanwhile, the main sale was already in full swing. Noble bidders clamored over glittering necklaces, jeweled goblets, and rare gemstones, their shouts echoing through the hall. Unseen behind the velvet drapes, Charles lay asleep in an iron cage, his fate bound up with every gavel strike. "Step lively now. Next lot, both jewelry and slaves. Present them in order." Manager Fay's sharp voice rang out. Attendants hustled past, trays of ornate rings and bracelets balanced carefully in their arms. One by one, chained captives were dragged forward, shackles clinking as they were forced onto the auction platform. In the courtyard just beyond the stalls, Charles shifted in his restless sleep, unaware of the din or the danger that drew ever closer with each approaching bid. Charles groaned as the clamor around him grew unbearable. He shot up, blinking against the dim light, and took in his surroundings in a single, stunned glance. Cold iron bars pressed against his back. Beyond them, dozens of exhausted figures, slaves just like him, huddled together in the same cage. "Where the hell am I? Why am I here? Oh, my head!" The throb at his temples reminded him of last night's excesses. He shook out the fog in his mind and tried to steady himself, but the movement drew a sharp response. A tall man beside him, his countenance regal even in chains, snarled awake. The so-called Red Earl swept the cell with a furious glare, his eyes landing on the bars, on the other prisoners, and finally on Charles. His face reddened, but he swallowed his outrage when he recognized the boy. With a vicious snap, he barked to those onlookers through the cage, "Quit staring and get back to work." At that moment, a wiry overseer stepped forward. Director Fei carried a heavy iron rod in one hand, his thin lips curling into a predatory smile. The other slaves shrank back at the sight of him, but Charles met his gaze without flinching. Fei chuckled, a low, menacing sound that echoed across the cramped enclosure. "Heh," he said, stepping closer, "so you've woken up at last." The cage rattled as the overseer raised his rod, and every eye turned to Charles, waiting for the next command. The day's labor was about to begin, and there would be no mercy for those who hesitated. "Charles, wake up! Come on! Open your eyes! If you sleep through this, you'll miss your turn at the auction, and you don't want to miss watching yourself get sold, do you?" Manager Fei still wielded some influence over Charles. After all, he'd only arrived the day before. Chapter 69. Prepare to Die. Charles blinked dully as he lifted his head. Across the dimly lit chamber, Manager Fei stood with a sneer. "Take another look at the world, kid," Fei jeered, "or you'll never get another chance." With that, he turned on his heel and stalked off, clearly unwilling to waste more time on a boy. Charles watched him go, mind spinning. Had Fei really just dismissed him so casually? He shook his head, trying to clear the fog in his thoughts. Then a voice cut through the silence, familiar, exasperated, almost amused. "What, finally awake?" Charles's head snapped around. In the next cell sat the man known as the Red Earl, Ryder. A heavy iron collar clamped around his neck. Ryder was chained to the far wall. He looked as irritated as ever, though his pride showed through. "Ryder, they locked you up too?" Charles managed, relief flooding him at the sight of an ally rather than a stranger. Ryder rolled his eyes. "Have you noticed anything else about our lovely accommodations?" he retorted, tone dripping with disdain. Charles stared at him. The cell was cold, its walls slick with moisture. Iron bars separated them from the corridor, where faint torchlight cast dancing shadows. Each prisoner wore a metal collar, slaves stripped of rank and rights. "Who did this to us?" Charles demanded, pounding a clenched fist against the cage door. Sparks flew from the iron, but the bars held firm. "Labor's management, or whoever's in charge, will pay for this," Ryder sighed. "Take it easy, kid. If you plan to break out of here by smashing bars, we're both going to be on the floor in pieces." He tipped his head toward the corridor. "Fei's gone to report back. They think we're finished, and that's their first mistake." Charles pressed his forehead against the cold metal, anger and fear ricocheting through him. They were at the mercy of these captors, but between him and Ryder lay their only hope, and Charles vowed he wouldn't let their enemies have the last word. Charles gripped the thick steel shackle at his wrist, and with a single Herculean effort, bent it into an S shape. The sickening snap echoed through the back courtyard and brought every laborer and guard to a dead halt. Heads swiveled, all eyes were fixed on him. Even the Red Earl, standing on the terrace, slapped a hand to his forehead in stunned disbelief. How could this lowly slave presume to do such a thing? Charles met the circle of startled faces with blazing eyes. "Who here has the nerve to imprison freeborn blood?" he demanded, his voice ringing out clear and fierce. A ripple of disbelief swept through the crowd. None of the onlookers expected a slave, least of all this scrawny boy, to talk back so boldly. The courtyard fell into an uneasy silence. Charles's nostrils flared as he leaned forward, challenging them. "Unshackle me this instant, or I swear I'll make you regret your insolence." The guards, mouths agape, exchanged incredulous glances. Then one, bigger and older than the rest, let out a booming laugh that soon spread around the yard. "Ha ha ha! Did you hear that?" he roared. "He actually thinks he can give orders around here. Best joke I've heard all year." The laughter grew, ringing mockingly off the stone walls, but Charles stood unmoved, his defiance blazing like wildfire. A harsh, mocking laugh rang out from the edge of the courtyard. The attendants paused at Charles's defiant words, then erupted into scornful guffaws. "Ha! Don't mind him," one sneered to his colleague, wiping tears of amusement from his eyes. "He's on the block soon. No wonder he's lost his head. I've been working at this auction house for years, and I've never seen him act this way." His partners snorted in agreement. "Enough chatter. Let's get back to work. And keep moving. The last thing we need is Manager Fei catching you loafing." In that moment, the courtyard fell strangely silent. No one noticed the tension coiling beneath Charles's skin, the sudden bulge of veins along his forearms as he tightened his grip on the iron cage. Rod by rod, the thick steel began to bend upward, groaning under his relentless pressure. From his seat on a nearby stone bench, the Red Earl leaned forward, eyes gleaming with interest. He made no move to intervene. This flimsy prison was never meant to hold Charles for long. He settled back with a wry smile, eager to witness the spectacle. With a final, ear-piercing creak, the last bar snapped free. Charles stepped out, composed and steady, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeves as if he'd merely stood up from a chair. Heads whipped around at the sudden movement. One attendant froze, his face draining of color. He pointed a trembling finger at Charles and stammered, "Oh no, this isn't good. The slave has escaped." Shouts erupted in the cramped back courtyard of the auction house. Crates and discarded packing straw rustled as the staff scrambled for cover. At the center of the uproar stood Charles, his ankles free of chains and his chest heaving with exertion. He met their panicked stares without flinching. "No good, he's out," one clerk gasped. "Anyone who can break those iron shackles and still stand tall, he's not ordinary. He's either a fool or a fighter, and I'm betting on the latter." Another staff member sprinted toward the solid oak door that led deeper into the yard and bellowed, "Get the thugs! A slave's on the run!" On the other side of that door, the auction house's hired muscle, tall, leather-clad brutes, froze at the shout. Hands hovered near the hilts of short swords. A second call from inside sent them leaping over barrels and broken crates, ready to swarm the courtyard. Charles didn't wait. He darted between wooden wine racks and upturned benches, every stride propelling him closer to the narrow alley beyond the rose garden wall. Footsteps thundered behind him as staffers and thugs converged from both ends of the courtyard, shouting for him to halt. Pushing himself harder, Charles reached the old gardener's gate, just wide enough for someone of his wiry build to slip through. The iron latch, as luck would have it, hung askew. He tugged it free and slipped into the darkness beyond. A dozen voices erupted as they realized he'd made it through. Charles didn't look back. With a final burst of speed, he vanished into the maze of moonlit alleys, the night swallowing him whole and his freedom intact. Charles drew the baton strapped to his side and strode into the back courtyard with an icy glare. 30 burly members of the Woolala gang followed close behind. The moment they appeared, the on-duty staff fell silent and parted on either side, forming a wide aisle for their passage. At the center of the courtyard, Charles came to a halt. Perched atop a massive iron cage was the Red Earl, clad in a flowing purple robe. As Charles stepped forward, the Earl sprang down, effortlessly emerging from the cage and settling himself on its roof to survey the newcomers. The gang leader raised a compact stun pistol and leveled it at Charles. "Slave," he snarled, "return to your cage, or I'll put you down." Charles met the barrel of the weapon without a flicker of fear. He stared at the 30-armed thugs, then turned with a faint, mocking smile to the Red Earl. "Shall I have Ryder set aside half of them for you?" From his lofty perch, the Red Earl swept a disdainful gaze across the assembled men, let out a soft, amused chuckle, and with a single dismissive wave of his hand, signaled the thugs to stand down. The Red Earl waved a dismissive hand and said, "I'm not interested in killing ants." Charles merely raised an eyebrow. 30-odd burly thugs surrounded him, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he turned his cold gaze on them and let a feral grin creep across his face. Snow-white teeth bared, utterly unhinged. He tilted his head and felt the explosive collar at his throat. "Nothing." "Are you ready to die?" he asked softly, the corners of his mouth curling upward. "Slaves." Before the nearest thug could even finish his startled Charles was already upon him. Faster than lightning, he drove one arm through the man's chest. The thug's eyes went wide, his face draining of color, a strangled gasp caught in his throat. Charles stood impassively in front of him, still smiling, and slowly withdrew his arm. With a sickening thud, the thug collapsed to the ground. He lay there staring up at Charles in abject horror, eyes locked on the wound, unable to utter another word. Moments later, he was dead. The goons behind him erupted in panicked cries of "Boss!" as they watched their leader collapse. Shock rooted them to the spot. No one dared to step forward. Chapter 70. Killing. Blood beaded on Charles's right arm and spattered across his cheek, but he barely noticed. His dark eyes flicked over the 30 remaining thugs arrayed before him, and a faint smile curved his lips. "Who's next?" he asked, voice calm and amused. Silence greeted him. They all remembered what had just happened. In the blink of an eye, one man had been punched through the chest, literally split in two, from a single blow. Fear paralyzed them. Not one dared move. Charles let out an exaggerated sigh and shook his head. "This is too easy. I was hoping for a challenge." He took a single, deliberate step forward. "Anyone else want to try?" Just as the tension began to snap, a sharp voice pierced the standoff. "What's going on back there? Where's the cargo? Get that crate up here immediately." The cry came from the auction stage, where Manager Fai hovered anxiously over a crowd of bidders. His tone was a frantic mix of panic and fury. In his line of work, delays were unforgivable, especially with his superior standing right beside him, watching every moment. Fai's heart raced. If he failed to signal the next lot on time, it wouldn't just be his reputation on the line. It might be his job. Behind Charles, the thugs exchanged panicked glances. Their hastily arranged ambush had gone horribly wrong, and now even the auction house staff were clamoring for order. Charles glanced back at the stage, wiping a smear of blood from his face. Then he turned to face his adversaries again, blood still dripping from his knuckles. "Sorry," he drawled, "but I'm not done yet." And with that, he launched himself into the fray once more, calm, collected, and utterly unstoppable. "Where are the bodies? Are they all dead? Move it. Send the next one down." Manager Fai stormed into the back courtyard, but the sight that met him froze him in his tracks. His staff was pressed against the warehouse walls, eyes wide with horror, every one of them staring down the long corridor. At the far end, a young man calmly turned his head to face them, Charles. Beside him, another figure suddenly collapsed, crumpling into a spreading pool of blood. Fai's heart pounded as he recognized the victim, his most trusted lieutenant, the very man who had helped him crush the street gang that once threatened the auction house. Now that aide lay motionless and unrepentant, life ebbing out in a bright red stain on the cold stone floor. Behind the fallen enforcer, more than 30 thugs huddled in terrified silence, their eyes locked on Charles, the slave who had only just awakened. How had he overpowered them so swiftly? And what of the other prisoner, the man in the iron cage, sold alongside Charles? Even without knowing every detail, Fai's decade of experience running this auction house told him exactly what he faced. A rebel fueled by desperation and ruthlessness. "Seal all exits," he barked, his voice echoing off the walls. "Get that slave. Alive if you can." Charles sauntered to a stop as Manager Fai's snarled command rang out. "Seize the runaway slave." He barely suppressed a smile. Instead of bolting, he pivoted to face Manager Fai, curiosity glinting in his eyes. Behind him, more than 30 auction house thugs froze on the spot, weapons half raised. None dared to advance. Fai's face flushed crimson with fury. "What are you waiting for? Move, now, or all of you will be made slaves yourselves." At that threat, the henchmen exchanged uneasy glances. They knew all too well the shame and misery that awaited a slave in the auction. Better to risk their lives than submit to chains. Grimly, they tightened their grips on swords and cudgels, then charged forward in a surging wave. Charles watched them come, his lips curving into a cold smirk. The real fight was about to begin. Do more than 30 of them really fear they can't take down the boy standing before them? Manager Fai murmured with a self-satisfied grin as a line of burly men marched toward the ring. He spun around to the staff flanking the arena and barked, "What are you waiting for? Get the next auction item out here at once. Drag your feet any longer, and you'll wish you hadn't." His glare was icy. In Fai's eyes, piling 30 men on one boy wasn't a noble challenge. It was cowardice. Behind him, a series of dull thuds echoed through the hall. Fai chuckled and strolled back toward the auction stage, unwilling to miss the next sale. Inside the ring, Charles sized up the approaching horde with cool contempt. Blades and clubs glinted under the arena lights as over 30 attackers closed in. With a single fluid stride, he lunged forward. His movements were ruthless. One kick, one punch, each delivered with pinpoint accuracy. Thud, thud, thud. Bodies flew backwards, slamming into the walls. In mere seconds, the floor was strewn with groaning, defeated men, and not a single one had landed a blow on Charles. Charles stood alone in the center of the arena, surrounded by iron cages holding dozens of shackled slaves. A single thunderous bang echoed through the field, and every eye fixed on him in stunned silence, all except Manager Faye, who remained oblivious to the unfolding carnage. Inside the cages, the captives pressed themselves against the bars, their faces alive with wonder. In Charles, they saw the spark of life and the promise of freedom. Without hesitation, Charles reached out and plucked a struggling man from the crowd. The man, barely taller than Charles's shoulder, writhed helplessly as cold arrogance gleamed in Charles's eyes. With a subtle tightening of his fingers, Charles crushed the man's skull in an instant. Blood spurted, and the body went limp, collapsing at Charles's feet. Only 2 guards remained, each clutching a weapon that trembled so violently it might drop from their grasp at any moment. Horror filled their faces as they backed away. Too late. Charles dropped the first corpse and advanced on them, a cruel smile curling his lips. In a single fluid motion, he seized one guard by the throat and snapped his neck effortlessly. Before the second man could scream, Charles's wrist flicked again. A crack echoed through the arena, and the guard slumped to the ground. 3 bodies lay motionless. 30 others had challenged Charles, and all 3 who had dared him lay dead before the silent, clanking cages. Inside, the slaves pressed forward, hope blazing in their eyes as they watched the boy who had just shattered 3 lives with nothing more than a flick of his hand. Charles watched Director Faye stride forward, utterly unfazed, and a faint smile curved his lips. In one fluid motion, he scooped up the 2 fallen guards' bodies and hurled them straight at Faye. The corpses screamed past the director's side. Bang, bang, gusts of displaced air brushing against him. Faye's eyes, barely open in focus, snapped wide. Had those bodies actually flown by? Before he could react, a louder crash reverberated through the corridor, rattling his senses. The impact carried into the main auction hall. Even Dudu, the auctioneer perched on the dais, stiffened at the sudden uproar from backstage. His heart lurched, but he forced on a dazzling smile and bellowed, 38 million Baileys. Do I hear 39? Remember, this is the finest pearl from the East China Sea, truly priceless. With a flourish, he lifted the scarlet cloth to reveal the pearl's soft, radiant glow under the spotlights. Yet the bidders sat in cold silence. The earlier commotion had sobered their enthusiasm. As the seconds ticked by without a new offer, Dudu cleared his throat. 38 million Baileys it is. Sold. And with that, the East China Sea pearl, the crowning jewel of the evening, found its new owner. Everyone fell silent. Dudu cursed under his breath, trying to pinpoint who had made that strange noise. In the private room, Wells knit his brow, a sudden chill of unease creeping up his spine. "What was that sound just now?" he murmured, though he couldn't shake the nagging sense that something was very wrong. Behind Charles, Manager Faye wiped cold sweat from his forehead, his eyes darting nervous, lie between Wells and Charles. Charles could hardly believe his eyes. More than 30 guards had fallen to a single opponent, one man who'd ripped through them with his bare hands. What a monster. Manager Faye stood before him, drenched in cold sweat, eyes wild with panic. Charles's lips curled into a small, unsettling smile as he took another determined step forward. "You, don't come any closer," Faye stammered, his hands shaking so badly that he nearly dropped the papers clutched in one fist. "Stop, or—" His gaze flicked to the metal collar fastened at Charles's throat, stamped with the number 98. A sudden strategy lit up Faye's terrified mind. He fumbled into his pocket and pulled out a small remote detonator. "Slave number 98, he whispered hoarsely, fingers flying over the dials. "If you take one more step, I will." Charles's brow furrowed as he registered the device, the weight of the explosive collar pressing at his neck. Faye, sensing his target's momentary hesitation, straightened his shoulders and forced his voice to rise. "Number 98, he barked, eyes blazing with urgent malice. Charles kept walking toward Manager Faye, unfazed by the detonator clutched in the man's hand. Faye's confident sneer faltered. Charles had terrified him only moments before with that inexplicable calm. "Return to the iron cage, or I'll blow you to pieces," Faye barked, trying to sound in control. Charles didn't slow down. Step by step, he closed the distance. "Number 98, are you deaf?" Faye's voice rose in panic. I told you. Stop. Do you want to die? Still Charles advanced in silence. Faye's jaw tightened. Fine, he whispered, fury flashing in his eyes. If you insist on looking for death, don't blame me. With a brutal press of the red button, Faye's thumb sank into the detonator's surface. He watched Charles, eager to see the boy's head explode. Beep, beep, beep. The red LED at Charles's neck began to flash wildly, each pulse echoing through the courtyard. Yet through it all, Charles allowed the faintest curve to touch his lips, a quiet, knowing smile aimed straight at Faye's feral expression. How dare he smile? Faye's heart pounded. Shouldn't the boy be terrified, cringing before the blast? Behind them, every slave in the yard had stopped to watch, their eyes wide with fear and astonishment at the chilling tableau. Charles stood on the auction block beneath the harsh glare of torches, surrounded by shackled slaves whose eyes glinted with a single desperate thought. Will you smile in the face of death? Once reviled as a merciless slaver, his cruel reputation now seemed almost noble to them, a flicker of hope that perhaps fate had more in store than this final auction. A sudden hiss cut through the tense air. With a thunderous roar, the metal collar around Charles's neck detonated. Smoke spiraled up from the blast, coating him in a gray cloud. For an instant, the entire great hall froze. An explosion, Wells shouted, his hand dropping to the hilt at his waist. Unease churned in his gut, but as he scanned the room, none of the other guards broke rank. Forcing himself to stay composed, he barked, "Secure the perimeter, now!" From his podium, Dudu's voice rang out, unnervingly calm. 10,000 credits. Do I hear 12? Though his tone betrayed nothing, his clenched jaw told a different story. Manager Faye was supposed to keep this place locked down. High above, in private box number 7, Mayor Hoyle's eyebrows shot up. He leaned forward, knuckles white on the railing. These intermittent blasts were far too convenient and far too frequent. He glanced at his fellow dignitaries, kept his frown hidden behind a practiced smile, and reminded himself that Faye would handle it. Through the haze of smoke, Charles lifted his head. His gaunt face was streaked with soot, but his dark eyes shone with fierce resolve. A slow, cold laugh broke the stunned silence. Ha! In that moment, every slave, every guard, and every noble in the chamber realized this was only the beginning. Go on, fight me if you dare. In the end, you'll kneel as my obedient slave. What's left to resist? Director Fai's feral laughter reverberated through the rear warehouse, echoing off the crates and steel beams. The row of shackled slaves before him cowered, heads bowed, too terrified to glance at Charles's still form at the center of the blasted floor. None knew his real name. He was only number 98. Yet they would never forget the boy who, unflinching, met death itself with a defiant smile. In that fleeting moment, each slave questioned himself. Could I choose freedom over a lifetime of chains? Would I risk everything just to claim my dignity? Faye's cruel mirth sliced through the tense air like a blade. Even the overseers lined up on either side exchanged uneasy looks as they stared at the explosion's crater. Never had they seen someone confront death so calmly and smile. At the edge of the wreckage, the Red Earl watched in silence, a thoughtful smile tugging at his lips. He refused to believe that Charles could simply be snuffed out. This was the young man he had come to admire. He could not be gone so easily. Suddenly, a crisp voice crackled in Director Faye's earpiece. "Director, care to explain why you're so amused?" Faye's laughter died on his lips. His grin faded into a frown. That voice, it was far too familiar. Manager Faye whipped his head around, straining to see through the dissipating smoke. There, standing unscathed, was Charles. You survived." Faye's voice trembled as his exclamation echoed across the back court. Every slave, among them Slave 98, who hovered just behind Faye, froze in astonishment. None had ever imagined anyone could walk away from that explosion alive. Charles stepped forward and laid a hand on Faye's shoulder. His tone was deceptively gentle. "Why would I die?" Faye's eyes widened. With the explosive collar rendered inert, he had no leverage over this slave. Before he could speak, Charles's grip tightened at his throat. A quiet force rippled through Charles as his mind-reading ability sprang to life, plunging deep into Faye's thoughts. In an instant, images of greed, cruelty, and contempt flashed through Charles's mind. He released Faye and spoke in a low, hard voice. "Your heart is absolutely filthy." Faye gasped, clawing at his neck. Around them, the back court buzzed with whispered speculation. Charles ignored the panic he'd sown and turned his gaze toward the front hall, the auction house beyond the courtyard gates. That was where the real fight for freedom would begin. Charles stared in disbelief at the grimy chamber before him. How could any place be this filthy? From his vantage point outside the auction hall, Charles's keen perception peered through the thick walls, reconstructing every detail of the commotion inside. A cool arrogance settled over him as he recognized exactly what had transpired in the front foyer. Without hesitation, he seized Director Fei by the collar and flung him through the reinforced doors. Fei's body flew like a rag doll across the hall, slamming into the far wall with a deafening crash. "What?" cried auctioneer Dudu, who was calling bids at the moment. Fei's impact knocked him off his feet, sending him sprawling face first to the floor. The entire room froze, stunned by the sudden violence. At the back of the hall, Wells sprang up, eyes wide. He'd learned to recognize Charles's unique presence, even through concrete, and hearing that familiar aura so close was a shock. "Major General," he called out, voice taut with alarm. The colonel beside him started to voice his confusion, but Wells cut him off with a steely look. The colonel fell silent, though his narrowed eyes betrayed a flicker of resentment. He knew better than to argue and forced himself to stand at attention. "What's going on?" The assembled nobles cried out in alarm as Charles suddenly lunged forward and struck Dudu without warning. The blow landed with brutal precision, and in an instant blood spurted across Dudu's tunic. Outraged, the aristocrats erupted into furious shouts and curses, their dignified composure shattered by the sudden savage attack. Chapter 72, Killing 3. "Bastard! What do you think you're doing?" A thunder of curses broke out as a lone figure strode from the corridor. Manager Fei had just smashed through. Charles paused, a cold smile curling his lips. Anyone who knew him would recognize that look as a harbinger of violence. Then he threw back his head and laughed, a long, hollow sound that reverberated across the auction platform. He walked to its center, surveying the princes, nobles, and wealthy merchants below. Their shock quickly turned to fury. "You little devil! Do you want to die? Get him off the stage! Take him down!" In the private viewing room on the second floor, Wells went pale. Beside him, Colonel Summer slammed his fist against the railing. "Charles!" Above them, Mayor Hoyle sat in his VIP balcony, forehead creased in irritation. He beckoned sharply to the men behind him. "Kill him." A black-suited bodyguard saluted and vaulted over the railing, crashing through the crowd as he bore down on Charles. Charles was still chuckling when a dark figure dropped from above and landed right in front of him. He froze mid-laugh and stared at the newcomer, a tall man in a black suit, wearing mirrored sunglasses. "Hey, what's this supposed to be?" Charles exclaimed, his grin faltering. "You an undercover agent? How much do they pay you?" Almost at once, Charles sensed the killer intent radiating off his opponent. Without a word, the man in black lunged. There was a sharp crack as Charles thrust up an arm to deflect a swift kick. "Secret Service, huh?" Charles taunted, shifting on his heels. In seconds, he'd sized up the stranger's moves, fluid, precise, but predictable. The man's brow furrowed behind those lenses. He clearly hadn't expected Charles to read him so fast. Frustrated by the failed strike, the agent eased back and snarled something unintelligible before rushing in again. This time, a silver-blue blade of energy arced toward Charles. In the same heartbeat, Charles twisted aside, and the blade shot past him, striking the Red Earl who just appeared at the edge of the stage. In an instant, the Red Earl's form glowed with a molten red sheen. His skin hardened like forged steel, and with a grin as wide as Charles's, he caught the energy blade bare-handed. Sparks flew off his grip. "Ha!" Charles cheered. Behind his shades, the man in black's eyes went wide. One opponent could dodge his strike, fine, but the other had actually caught it. Who were these two? And what in the world did they want? All at once, the crowd surrounding the ring froze, startled by the swift, inhuman movement of the so-called Red Earl. Whispers rippled through the spectators. Is he even human? Every eye snapped toward him as Charles, once known as Charlotte, stepped forward, a faint, mocking smile curling his lips. Before anyone could react, Charles darted across the floor like a striking snake. In one seamless motion, he closed the distance to the man in the sharp black suit and clasped his throat with unrelenting force. The suited agent staggered, half raising a pistol, but Charles's reflexes were legendary, and in that instant, his latent mind-reading ability flared to life. "Heh," Charles murmured, voice low and amused as he sifted through the agent's thoughts. "A lackey of the world government, CP9. Horror flickered across the agent's face. Fingers trembling, he jabbed the pistol against Charles's chest, hoping to break free. Only his hand struck unyielding steel, Charles's gauntleted forearm. A sharp cry escaped him as pain lanced up his arm. Charles's lips curved into a disdainful grin. With a single, imperious squeeze, he cut off the agent's last gasp. The body went limp in his grasp before sliding limply to the floor, lifeless. High above in Boxnum, on the second level, Hoyle pressed himself against the railing, wide-eyed and breathless. He had just witnessed something far beyond ordinary, and he knew he would never look at Charles, the Red Earl, in quite the same way again. The moment Charles saw his bodyguard collapse, he sprang to his feet and flung open the ornate chest before him. "Friends, welcome. I am Hoyle, Mayor of Seven Waters and proprietor of this auction house. It's a pleasure. Now please, for my sake, put an end to this. Name your price, and I will pay it." From the second-floor gallery, Hoyle peered down at Charles, his voice brimming with frantic politeness. Charles's lips curled into a disdainful smirk as he answered, "So this auction house belongs to you. No wonder you have the gall to treat both labor and capital as your slaves." The smirk vanished from Charles's face, replaced by a chilling intensity that turned the air between them razor-sharp. Hoyle's eyes went wide with alarm. Sweat beaded on his brow as he dabbed at it with a trembling handkerchief. In the private viewing chamber below, Wells's breath caught in his throat. Yesterday, he had scoured every corner of Seven Waters in search of Charles and come up empty. Even rumors of the boy's whereabouts had led nowhere. Now he understood. Charles had been captured and sold off by this very auction house. And yet, who could possibly subdue Charles? The thought sent a jolt through Wells, just as Charles's voice rang out again, each word laced with lethal determination. Charles stood silent, his gaze unwavering as the tension in the auction hall ratcheted higher. Before him, the man known as Hoyle forced a smile, though beads of sweat dotted his brow. "This is all a misunderstanding," Hoyle blurted, stepping forward while motioning frantically to the burly figures behind him. He needed to placate this stranger, at least long enough for his men to find a way out. He took a steadying breath and pressed on. "Please, allow us to make amends. 5 billion Baileys, right here, right now. And to prove our sincerity, you may choose any 3 items from the auction house as well." Silence fell. Charles didn't reply. Instead, every pair of eyes around him gleamed with avarice. 5 billion Baileys was a fortune none of them could claim, but those 3 coveted lots? That was a prize worth far more. Out of the hush, a towering, bearded man thundered, "Kid, you're in way over your head. This isn't your arena, so scram." His companions laughed, closing ranks around Charles like circling wolves. "Our boss is in a good mood," the bearded man taunted. "Get lost now, or we'll make you regret sticking your nose in here." Their threats rolled through the hall like rolling thunder. Charles's expression darkened, his pulse quickening, but his stance never wavered. The hall watched, breath held, as the young man refused to back down. The Red Earl leaned back against the stone balustrade, watching the standoff with keen interest. He'd been curious to see how Charles would handle himself, and now he was eager for the answer. A low, mirthless chuckle rose from his throat. "Ha! I never meant to turn this into a bloodbath," the Red Earl called out, voice carrying across the courtyard. "But your defiance has piqued my ire. Perhaps your own blood will soothe my temper." Charles's grin turned savage, the dried stains on his cheek only sharpening his feral look. For a heartbeat, the assembled crowd fell silent, then laughter erupted around him. "Ha! Did you hear that?" roared the Grand Duke of the Arabian Kingdom of Palestine from his lofty vantage. His tone dripped with contempt. "He actually dares to threaten me with death." He threw back his head and laughed, a rich, thunderous sound that rolled through the onlookers like an echo. "Boy, do you know who you're speaking to? I am the Grand Duke of Palestine. And here you stand, promising to kill me? Ha!" At his command, the rest joined in, courtiers and guards alike, snickering and shaking their heads. In their eyes, Charles was nothing more than a reckless youth who'd killed a handful of palace guards and fancied himself a hero. Their mockery stoked something fierce within Charles. He stepped forward, shoulders squared and fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. "If you crave death," he said, voice icy calm, "then I will gladly grant it." In that moment, an undeniable arrogance radiated from him, an overwhelming force that branded itself on every spectator's mind. The laughter died on their lips as they sensed the storm he was about to unleash. Under Charles's control, he didn't even unleash his full strength. He merely directed a subtle surge of force toward the gathered crowd. Thud, thud! In an instant, every person in the auction hall staggered, then crumpled to their knees or collapsed face first on the floor. They stared up at Charles in stunned disbelief, utterly unable to comprehend what had just happened to them. Chapter 73. Killing. Damn it! Major General Wells reeled under Charles's oppressive glare, his legs giving way as he fought to stay upright. Unlike the others who simply froze in place, Wells struggled to maintain his balance. "Your Majesty, Major General, sir," the colonel beside him blurted, sweat glaring on his brow. He tumbled from his stool, collapsing onto the floor in a knelt posture, eyes wide with terror. Charles advanced toward them with measured steps, every inch of his posture radiating cold authority. Wells, desperate, fumbled for his concealed transmitter, a tiny bugged phone meant to call for backup. But the moment he powered it on, the device stuttered, coughed out a wisp of smoke, and died in his hand. "Not good," Wells hissed, staring at the smoking gadget. The bug's fried." Charles allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. He had intended this all along. His famous, domineering stare was no mere legend. It sent a crackling shock through anyone within 30 meters, shattering nerves and short-circuiting electronics alike. Now, consumed by a dark fury that demanded release, Charles hovered over the incapacitated officers. Every last person in this room had wronged him, and only the final, irrevocable act would purge the rage coiling in his chest. He raised his chin, gaze sweeping the room one last time. The air itself seemed to tremble. Then Charles struck. Charles strode into the auction hall with measured, unhurried steps. A hushed tension fell over the crowd as every pair of eyes followed him, wide with disbelief. At the front of the room, the Grand Duke sprang to his feet and bellowed, "Stop right there!" In an instant, Charles closed the distance. His hand shot out, clamping around the Grand Duke's throat. Lifting him effortlessly from the floor, Charles pressed close, his voice low and mocking. "You don't suppose I'd shy away from killing you, do you?" The Duke's face flushed crimson. He tried to sputter a retort, but before a word could form, a sickening crack rang out. Heads whipped toward the sound. The Grand Duke hung limp in Charles's grip, a broken corpse, his head tilted grotesquely to one side. A gasp rippled through the assembled nobles. He actually killed him," someone whispered in horror. Across the hall, a silk-clad aristocrat recoiled, hand pressed to her mouth. "My God! Call the guards! Arrest him!" rang frantic shouts. "Security! Someone stop him!" Pandemonium erupted. Chairs toppled, people scrambled for the exits, and frightened cries filled every corner of the room. From the balcony above, Mayor Hoyle knelt among the stunned onlookers. His heart pounded as he stared down at Charles, the man who had just murdered a Grand Duke in cold blood before all these witnesses. Such brazen defiance of the law and of every noble code was unthinkable. Yet there he stood, perfectly calm, as chaos raged around him. Charles could already see how this would play out. The nations allied under the world government would soon pressure their own organization to make an example of him. The auction itself would turn into a bloodbath, and he'd be the first victim. His only hope was to have himself removed from the equation, permanently. Hoyle's face darkened at the thought. "Do it! Kill him!" he bellowed from the second level, jabbing a finger at Charles. The roar echoed through the auction hall, but Charles paid it no mind. Instead, he strode toward the next young man in line, the one who had sneered at him moments before. With a quick motion, Charles pinched the boy's cheek and leaned in to whisper. Feeling mighty big now? The boy's eyes went wide. Terror rippled through him like a shockwave, and then, embarrassingly, he lost control of his bladder. Charles stepped back, disgusted. A wave of cruel laughter crashed over the hall. From his seat atop the auction stage, the Red Earl leaned forward, lips curling into a merciless smile. His laughter rang out, sharp and mocking. Ha! Charles met the Earl's gaze with cold fury, then turned his glare on the humiliated boy at his feet. The message was clear. No one dared mock him again. Charles's finger snapped forward in a flash of power. A searing blast shot from his fingertip straight into the head of the noble youth who had been brazenly relieving himself. In an instant, the force erupted, tearing the boy's skull apart in a grotesque spray of bone and brain matter. A collective gasp of terror rippled through the auction hall. What? Noblemen, noblewomen, and servants alike went pale, stumbling backward in horror. Yet despite their frantic retreat, none could break free from Charles's oppressive presence. His mastery of the Overlord's aura was absolute. He could unleash or withdraw it at will, wielding it like a weapon. Beside Charles, the Red Earl watched in awe. Never before had he witnessed such flawless control over one's own power. "Noisy!" Charles bellowed, his voice crackling with restrained fury. But his roar was swallowed by the panic-stricken crowd. "Help! Murderer! Sheriff! Sheriff! Where are the guards?" Cries for authority filled the room as the terrified onlookers clamored for someone, anyone, to stop the bloodshed. Charles's anger flared when so many of the nobles refused to answer him. "Ha ha! Still won't obey? Fine, shout if you want to die." He raised a hand, and with each crackle of displaced air, a single noble clutched his forehead, and then his skull exploded in a spray of bone and blood. Bang! 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 One after another, the unfortunate men collapsed as their heads detonated like bursting fruit. At Charles's side, the Red Earl clicked his tongue in appreciation of the grisly spectacle. He'd never seen anything quite like it, brains flecking the air, gore pooling at their feet. Any ordinary witness would have retched. Wells watched in horror, tears blurring his vision. He could hardly believe such savagery was happening before him. Proud aristocrats reduced to nothing for daring to raise their voices. He surged forward, desperate to stop Charles, but an invisible force pinned him so suddenly that he crashed to his knees with a gasp. Thrown off balance, helpless, he stared at the carnage in stunned silence. A whirlwind of shame and rage swelled in Wells's chest. He hated Charles, hated the merciless power wielded so casually, and he hated himself even more for being too weak, too frightened to stop it. All around him, bodies lay splayed on the marble floor, hands pressed to their skulls. Not a whisper escaped their throats. Anyone bold enough to cry out had already lost their head. Charles's blood-red eyes swept the room. The grand auction hall was deathly silent. One could hear a pin drop. He leveled his pistol at the motionless crowd and felt a grim satisfaction settle in his chest. Yet he knew his work was far from finished. One culprit still lurked behind closed doors. Without hesitation, Charles strode to the marked private chamber, room number 7, vaulted onto the raised platform, and flung the door open. Inside, under the stark glare of the spotlights, stood Hoyle, his face drained of color. Before Hoyle could draw a breath, Charles seized him by the collar and dragged him out into the hall. Chest heaving, he pressed the gun barrel against Hoyle's temple. "Spare my life!" Hoyle stammered, dropping to his knees. He clutched at Charles's trousers, desperation in every tremor. Charles's expression didn't flicker. He stooped, gripped a handful of Hoyle's white hair, and hauled his head up until their eyes met. "Tell me," Charles said, voice low and cold, "is this auction house yours?" He held Hoyle's gaze, demanding the truth. Chapter 74, Killing 5. Hoyle had no idea what Charles was driving at, but he nodded nonetheless. Seeing the motion, Charles allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. "Good," he said softly. "I didn't get the wrong man." He tightened his grip, lifting Hoyle clear off the floor. Looking down with a deadly calm, Charles asked, "Your auction house, how dare you detain me and put me up for bid? Tell me, how do you expect me to settle the score?" Hoyle's face burned crimson. Dangling by the neck, he was utterly helpless, his life literally in Charles's hands. He cursed inwardly at his absent thugs. Where were his reinforcements when he needed them? He kicked feebly at the floor, desperate to pry himself free. What Hoyle didn't know was that Charles had already dealt with all 30-plus henchmen in the auction hall. Every last one lay unconscious or worse. Even his lieutenant had vanished without a trace. Before Hoyle could protest further, a familiar voice rang out behind them. "Hey, wait a minute. Isn't that Brother Charles? What brings you here in such a hurry?" G. Benz strode into the hall, pausing in surprise at the scene before him. Charles strode through the bustling streets of the Seven Rivers capital, his mind on the mayor's morning briefing. The city stretched out over 3 sprawling acres, and without the right connections, it was easy to be trampled underfoot. Out of the corner of his eye, he spotted a familiar face hurtling toward him. G. Benz, Chief Fei's eager subordinate from the auction house. G. Benz was in charge of procuring slaves, and he knew that getting close to Mayor Hoyle's right-hand man could only help his own standing. "Charles," G. Benz called, practically bowing as he approached. "You don't recognize me? I'm G. Benz, Director Fei's assistant. I'm the one who finds slaves for the auction house." Charles glanced at him coolly. Then recognition dawned. "Ah, right. You were with Director Fei. Of course I remember." He started to turn away, but G. Benz hurried to keep up. "Wait, aren't you in a rush?" he panted. "Something's gone wrong at the auction house. One of our slaves escaped, and the mayor wants reinforcements. But the auction house muscle has vanished. Could you lend a hand?" Charles paused. The mayor's request couldn't be ignored, especially not from someone like Mayor Hoyle. "Lead the way," he said, straightening his shoulders. "Let's find that runaway before things get worse." Charles clenched his jaw. "If I can't find them anywhere else, I'll have to go to the city hall." He set off at a brisk pace. At the mention of an escaped slave, Keeban suddenly straightened, his eyes alight with opportunity. This was his moment to prove himself as a professional slave catcher. He darted after Charles and grabbed his arm. "Hold on a second, Charles. Why run to the magistrate and dump the whole mess on him? Leave this to me. I'm the expert in rounding up runaway slaves." Charles paused, considering Keeban's confidence. Of course, it made no sense to go alone to the sheriff's office and abandon a seasoned slave catcher back at the tavern. A grin spread across his face. "You're right. Let's head straight to the auction house and put a stop to that fugitive." Keeban gave him an approving nod, then steered him toward the familiar tavern where his comrades were gathered. Bursting through the door, he bellowed, "Jack! Ready the men! There's work to be done!" Jack, the tavern's burly proprietor, hurried his regulars aside and joined them at the entrance. "All right, what's the plan?" he asked, gripping Keeban's shoulder in solidarity. With their small band now assembled, Charles felt hope rise in his chest. Together, they would chase down the runaway and restore order before long. Here's a revised, polished version of the scene, with the main character renamed Charles and rendered in natural, idiomatic English. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I present Brother Charles?" G. Ben stepped forward, gesturing grandly to the crowd. Second only to the mayor himself, Charles here is one of the most powerful men in the entire city of Seven Waters. From now on, you'll all address him as Brother Charles. Charles felt a surge of relief at the formal introduction, but he didn't lose sight of his mission. He grabbed G. Ben's sleeve and urged, "Brother G. Ben, let's move. There are still dozens of people waiting inside the auction house. We can't keep them hanging around." All right, G. Ben laughed, clapping him on the shoulder. "Let's go." With that, G. Ben raised his hand in a swift signal. A company of nearly 70 men, slave-hunting crews from around town, dressed in stark black and white, fell into formation behind him. Today, G. Ben was determined to impress Charles, so he'd brought the entire force along. "Boss, what's the occasion?" demanded a grizzled, one-eyed trafficker, his long knife resting at his hip. He grabbed G. Ben's tunic and narrowed his good eye. Leaning close so only his lieutenant could hear, G. Ben hissed, "Something's gone haywire in the auction house. One of the slaves broke free and is wreaking havoc inside." The trafficker's lips curled into a grin of anticipation. "Now that sounds like a job for us." With the slave hunters at the ready and Charles at his side, G. Ben led the charge toward the auction house, each man poised for the chaos they expected to find within. "Our boss wants to unveil it before Mayor Hoyle, and he insists on bringing every one of us along." "Understood," the one-eyed man said, nodding eagerly. He, too, craved an opportunity to impress the mayor. After all, good things only ever come from pleasing those in power. With the same thought in mind, the entire group strode toward the auction house, heads held high, hearts pounding with anticipation. Inside, the usual din of bids and chatter died the instant Charles entered. With a single oppressive glance, he drained the room of its bravado. No one dared raise a paddle or shout a price. The very air seemed to recoil from him. At the center of the hushed crowd stood Mayor Hoyle, smug in his finery. Without warning, Charles advanced, boot raised. He brought it down hard on Hoyle's knee. A sickening crack echoed, followed by the mayor's guttural scream. Charles shifted his weight and ground his heel into Hoyle's wrist. Blood fountained, staining the polished floor. "Ugh, please, mercy!" Hoyle choked out, his voice ragged with pain. He tried to crawl away, but Charles pressed on, driving the heel of his boot deeper. Each movement flexed bone and tore flesh. The mayor's pleading eyes rolled upward in sheer terror. Around them, the assembled guests stood frozen, unwilling to draw even a whisper of attention. They had long ago decided Charles was mad and far too dangerous to cross. "Anything!" Hoyle gasped, blood soaking his sleeve. "I'll repay you. Just spare me." Charles paused, boot hovering over the shattered wrist. A slow smile curved his lips, but his eyes remained cold and unyielding. In that moment, the auction house realized they were witnessing more than retribution. They had stumbled into the depths of Charles's wrath, and no plea would satisfy him now. Charles heard the sickening crack of bone beneath his boot as he drove his heel down on Hoyle's hand. A strangled howl escaped the man's lips. "I'll let you live," Charles murmured, the faintest edge of amusement in his voice. "But who will speak for the poor souls you've sold into slavery?" When Charles first encountered Hoyle, he'd uncovered every vile misdeed the man had committed. Normally, Charles avoided getting involved in other people's affairs, but when injustice tugged at his conscience, he couldn't look away. His thoughts grew clouded until he set things right. Hoyle's agonized cry pierced the chamber again as bones splintered beneath the pressure. Blood spurted, flesh teared, and the man staggered, his senses swimming with pain. He teetered on the brink of unconsciousness, but each searing jolt kept him painfully awake. From his vantage point, the Red Earl watched in stunned fascination. Now he understood the grim origin of Charles's nickname, the Blood Swordsman. Though the Earl himself was no stranger to dark deeds, and possessed the uncanny ability to delve into others' thoughts, he paled in comparison to this boy's cold, unflinching brutality. A final, echoing crack rang out as Hoyle slumped to the floor, the chamber falling into a deathly hush. Chapter 75, Killing 6. A thunderous crack echoed through the room as the door splintered inward. Every head snapped toward the noise. Hoyle even managed to turn his battered face, though pain twisted his features. Then, as the newcomer stepped over the threshold, the deposed mayor's eyes gleamed with triumph. "Ha! You're all finished! Finished!" Hoyle roared, a mad grin spreading across his bruised face. He believed his loyal guards had come to rescue him. Stripped of his title and stripped of hope, he would at least make his enemies suffer. "Seize him," he barked, gesturing wildly. "Tear him apart, slowly. Make him plead for mercy." Hoyle lay collapsed on the floor, his limbs twisted, patches of coagulated blood crusting his clothes. He howled orders at the very men who belonged to Charles's rescue party, his voice both pitiable and terrifying. Charles stared in disbelief at the ruined figure before him. If not for that rasping, familiar voice, he would never have recognized the man who'd once held the town's highest office. Reeling, Charles turned to Keeban and shook his head. "Quick, help the mayor," Charles called urgently, grabbing Keeban's arm. "We have to stop the bleeding and get him out of here." Keeban's face mirrored his shock as he knelt beside Hoyle, already tearing strips from his own tunic to staunch the flow of blood. Outside the shattered door, Charles's companions formed a protective circle, ready to strike back if Hoyle's remaining guards tried another attack. As Charles knelt in the flickering lamplight, forcing back his turmoil, he vowed to save this broken man, no matter how deep the betrayal or how bitter the cost. Charles drew a ragged breath, the once majestic figure now a ruin, gray hair matted with crimson, his black suit shredded and blood-stained, every trace of former dignity stripped away. Before him, Mayor Hoyle groaned on all fours, the boy's boot pressing into his back. "Hello," Charles called brightly. Jabens went rigid. Wasn't this the drunk he'd delivered just yesterday?" Terror knotted his stomach. The slave he'd traded away was trampling the mayor, and if he tried to seize him again, how could he ever escape Mayor Hoyle's fury? In an instant, Jabens felt the world closing in. His career, his life, all teetered on the brink of collapse. He glanced at the 60 or so men he'd summoned, Any of them could charge at Charles, swarm him, but he knew it would be futile. Charles was death incarnate. Not one guard would survive such an assault. Charles, meanwhile, studied the approaching force with keen interest, ignoring the mayor's desperate curses beneath his boot. At his side, the Red Earl shook his head in exasperation. These men had come to fight and to die for nothing. With a baleful grin, Charles raised his hand and called out, "Come on, gentlemen, rescue the mayor! Mayor, brothers, defend the mayor!" A ripple of panic swept through the townsfolk as Mayor Hoyle struggled beneath Charles's boot. Torches bobbed, and crude weapons, pitchforks, blades, even farm tools were thrust toward him. Ironically, those shouting the loudest found safety behind the front lines, waving banners while cowering behind their neighbors. Charles remained calm. With a swift pivot, he shoved Mayor Hoyle aside. He wasn't taunting the man. He simply didn't want an errant sword cutting through friend and foe indiscriminately. A blade without sight could kill anyone in this fray, and Charles had no desire to be responsible for the mayor's blood. The mob surged forward, faces twisted with fury. A predatory grin spread across Charles's features. His greatsword lay in splinters on the ground behind him, a casualty of the earlier skirmish. No matter. He could make do with his bare knuckles. Thwack! A burly townsman lunged at him, steel glinting in the torchlight. In a heartbeat, Charles's fist shot out, hard as iron, and slammed into the man's chest. Bones cracked beneath the blow, and the attacker crumpled, clutching his side as pain stole the fight from his eyes. Silence fell for a heartbeat. Then, the rest of the mob hesitated, fear flickering where rage had burned moments before. Charles stood ready, fists clenched and eyes cold as steel, daring them to make the next move. Charles's fist struck like a pistol shot, the impact driving clean through the visitor's chest. One heartbeat later, the man crumpled to the ground, dead. Without even a glance, Charles retracted his arm and, with a roar that echoed through the plaza, charged into the crowd like a tiger bounding down from the mountains. Screams shattered the stunned silence. Some ran, others collapsed in terror. Among them, Mayor Hoyle clutched his own wounded side, momentarily forgetting his pain as he watched this impossible display of strength. Who was this slave, and how could he be so powerful? The mayor had expected only an escort, perhaps a show of force to humble him, not a slaughter. Jeben, standing close by, had no time to ponder what punishment the mayor might suffer. His only thought was how to handle the slave who was cutting swaths through their ranks. As more bodies fell, panic spread like wildfire among the governor's men. It's a monster! Get away!" someone shouted. Others joined the chorus, and the plaza erupted into chaos as everyone turned tail and fled. "It's a monster!" someone screamed. At their leader's signal, more and more bidders dropped their weapons and bolted for the exits. But Charles wasn't about to let them slip away so easily. Like a tiger on the hunt, he darted in front of their retreating line. "Ha! Nowhere to run once you've walked in," he jeered, voice booming through the cavernous auction hall. He laughed, eyes sweeping over the terrified crowd. An invisible pressure radiated from him, pinning each person in place. No one fainted outright, but every breath felt like it was being squeezed from their lungs. "Strange, weird, a monster," came the frantic chorus. Confronted by Charles's savage glare, the assembled bidders recoiled. "A demon! A devil! It's a devil!" they howled in unison. With every corridor and side door blocked by Charles's merciless charge, no one dared band together to fight. They scattered instead, darting through the auction house's labyrinth of halls, desperate to escape through any exit but the main gate. And Charles cut them down without mercy. Each terrified scream and every life extinguished fueled a dark exhilaration within him. As the bloodshed mounted, the crushing despair that had gripped his heart since dawn began to dissipate, washed away, drop by drop, by the fierce thrill of the hunt. A heavy gloom settled over the entire auction hall, and a cold voice in Charles's mind urged him to slaughter everyone present. The darkness pressed on him, twisting his thoughts into agony. Only by extinguishing every life here could he hope to ease that inner torment, even if only for a moment. Without warning, Charles unleashed the Navy's six-style cut. In a blur of steel, the auction runners who tried to flank him collapsed one by one. The fierce metallic tang of blood filled the air, and Charles felt a fierce, intoxicating thrill. His uniform was soaked crimson, as if he'd waded through a river of gore. When he finally stopped, stunned silence reigned. Only the Red Earl, perched in the highest gallery, observed with a cool, amused interest. Beneath him, everyone else, princes and nobles who had been concealed under the benches, Charlie Keeban, who had come to lend support, and a handful of junior officers, sat frozen in disbelief. Their vacant, wide-eyed stare betrayed the shattering of every expectation. Deep fear coiled in their hearts, whispering that none of them would emerge from this hall unscathed. Major General Wells stood alone in the private room on the second floor, staring down at the carnage below. A bone-deep chill crept up from his iced-over hands and feet, tightening around his heart like a vice. He had never witnessed such savage brutality, bodies torn apart, skulls crushed in the mud, and the gruesome spectacle assaulted his very sense of reality. Even after years in the Navy, had only faced pirates at sea with long-range shelling, he'd never seen violence so raw and merciless. Chapter 76, Slaughter, Part 7. When artillery was out of the question, the fight came down to steel and flesh. Daggers that flashed white on entry and red on exit, flintlock pistols thundering from a distance, none of it mattered against Charles's bare knuckles. Every punch he threw felt like a sledgehammer to their ribs. Ouch! One of the thugs finally couldn't take it anymore and vomited onto the marble floor. That single wretch set off a chain reaction. Within seconds, more than a dozen of the weaker men dropped to their knees, heaving bile across the hall. Charles glanced at the scene, but lost interest in the mess. Vomit was hardly the height of entertainment. Yet as the hiss of panic and pain faded, a strange unease settled over him. The blood-red haze that had tinted his vision began to clear, and with it went the fierce adrenaline rush of battle. He looked at the corpses strewn at his feet and felt, not remorse, but irritation, an odd, empty frustration. He realized suddenly that he'd been mistaken about himself. He'd believed the after-effects of his tyrannical aura, its involuntary flare-ups of rage and power, were gone for good. In truth, they'd only been coiled down, waiting. The brutal skirmish in this auction house had detonated every last one of them. Charles pressed a hand against his temple, trying to ward off the dizziness. He knew better than anyone how dangerous that aura could be, not only to his foes but to his own mind. And now, with those suppressed energies finally erupting, he had no idea what would happen next. Charles had deliberately skipped the mental conditioning drills in his tricolor domination practice. He was convinced that bypassing those introspective exercises would blunt the sway of his emotions. At first, the plan seemed flawless, until the moment dread washed over him like a chill breeze. His heart pounded, and a surge of guilt followed. He recognized it for what it was, the recoil of his own arrogance. Before he could stop himself, Charles discovered he was moving closer to the Red Earl. Immediately, the noble recoiled. "Ugh! Stay back! You're filthy!" the Earl exclaimed, scrambling to his feet and inching away in revulsion. Charles froze mid-step. The Earl wouldn't stop retreating until they were well apart. Charles pressed his fingers to his forehead, where a dark vein throbbed in irritation. Glancing down, he saw fresh blood spattered across his tunic from their last drill. Wonderful. He'd not only scared off the Earl, he was revolted by the sight of himself. He drew in a steadying breath. This couldn't happen again. After years of sword training, he had set his sights on the same composed, indomitable presence as legends like Hawkeye Mihawk. No more half measures. From now on, Charles would present the arrogant, unflappable facade of a true master of the blade. Charles clenched his fists, thinking, this can't go on. Keeban and Charlie were already shepherding their men toward the heavy wooden door, every footstep measured and slow. Charles knew that if they stayed any longer, they were as good as dead. Then something in the air shifted, a faint stir of breath and movement, and Charles snapped his head up, eyes locking on Keeban's retreating form. "They've spotted us. Run!" Keeban, who'd been watching Charles all along, barked the warning and straightaway broke into a desperate sprint. His men followed suit, abandoning caution as they charged for the exit. In an instant, they'd crossed the threshold and spilled into the corridor beyond. "Want to run?" Charles called out, a cold smirk playing on his lips. He slid into motion, his body flowing with the precision of the Navy Six style he had mastered. Before Keban's men could blink, Charles darted around the nearest support beam and landed right behind them. Unaware of the danger at their heels, the entire ragged band barreled through the doorway in a tight knot, exactly the mistake Charles had been waiting for. He tensed, ready to strike, confident that no one could escape his reach now. Perhaps they thought there was safety in numbers until Charles proved them wrong. He stood a few paces from the clustered men, their confidence bolstered by the sheer size of their group. Charles waited for that moment of complacency, then murmured the name of his technique, Azure Flash Kick. In the very next instant, he spun like a cyclone. A pale, almost luminous wave of force pulsed from his foot, slicing through every man at the waist in a single, breath-stealing strike. First there was the shock of cold steel against flesh. Then, in slow motion, their torsos pitched backward as their severed legs flew forward a few feet and collapsed in tandem. The courtyard was drenched in crimson, viscera spilled onto the stones, and panicked cries rang out among the survivors. A handful of men tried to scramble away, but they didn't get far before their strength failed them, and they, too, crumpled to the ground. From just beyond the auction house's iron railing, a cluster of onlookers, curious townsfolk who had followed G. Ben and Charles along with over 60 guards, watched in horrified fascination. They'd hung back, staying behind the barriers to avoid any unpleasantness. From that distance, they caught only muffled screams and distant splashes of blood on the flagstones. Some whispered that an escaped slave must have been hunted down and put to the sword. None of them suspected the true horror unfolding yards away, the clean, brutal efficiency of a single boy's strike. After a few tense moments, a group of terrified figures hurtled out of the auction hall, faces drained of color. Word had already spread that it was Commander Charles who'd led the squad inside. Among the fleeing were Barovane, the capital's most notorious slave trader, and the mayor's own assistant, men of the highest standing in the Seven Waters capital. Yet one by one, they bolted like frightened children. Then at the threshold, Charles appeared as if from thin air. With a single precise kick, he unleashed a dazzling white shockwave that rippled outward from his boot. The guards caught in its path were cleaved clean at the waist, their bodies collapsed, twin pools of silence following the stunned gasps of witnesses. A woman in the crowd couldn't help herself. "My God!" she screamed, clutching her throat. Charles didn't pause to gloat. He turned on his heel, stepped back into the auction hall, and quietly shut the heavy doors. Outside, though, the horror had already been witnessed by dozens, nobles, merchants, servants. One determined reporter, camera in hand, managed to capture Charles's steely expression just before the doors slammed shut. As more than 60 armed men thundered into the auction hall, the on-site reporter didn't hesitate. He raised his camera and unleashed a rapid burst of shots, images he knew would astonish his editor back at headquarters. At that moment, he had no inkling of Charles's true standing. To him, Charles was just another brash rookie pirate, bound to make headlines. Charles had re-entered the hall in a blur. In less than 3 strides, he'd neutralized every threat, so quickly that the would-be attackers crumpled to the floor before they could even draw their blades. They lay there in stunned silence, desperately praying he hadn't noticed them. Of course he had. Even without flaunting any intimidating aura, Charles possessed reflexes and perception sharp enough to catch the slightest twitch or hesitation. Unfazed, Charles stepped over the fallen bodies and made his way to the heart of the chaos, Mayor Hoyle. The mayor lay face down on the marble floor, half conscious, groaning with pain. Every ounce of his authority seemed to have evaporated in that instant. With hollow, frightened eyes, he stared up at Charles, fully aware that he'd lost all control, and that there was no pardon for what had just transpired. Charles watched the old pirate's spirit fade, confusion and pity warring in his chest. Hoyle, once a boisterous force of nature, lay slumped against the weathered planks of the deck, his breath shallow. "I'm getting too old for this fight," Hoyle rasped, blinking up at Charles with a half-smile. Still, a fierce gleam lingered in his eyes. Charles knelt beside him, hesitating. "You don't have to." Hoyle cut him off with a raspy laugh. He cough-sputtered, then found his strength for one last declaration. "Just you wait," he croaked, fixing Charles with a daring stare. "The world government will avenge me, the Navy will hunt me down, and they'll put my name on the wanted list for all the world to see." He threw back his head and laughed again, the sound trembling like a final echo. Then the light left his eyes. Those defiant words were all Charles heard before Hoyle slipped away. Chapter 77. Shackles. Charles's lip curled in disdain as Hoyle's words rang in his ears. He'd been wanted for a lime now. His bounty still stood at 5 billion Baileys. Most would tremble at such a price on their head. For him, it only meant greater infamy, a wider reputation. He stepped forward and delivered a single, devastating kick to Hoyle's temple. The man's head snapped back, his body went limp, and the auction hall fell deathly silent. Charles exhaled, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. The tension drained from his muscles, and the heavy gloom that had settled in his chest vanished. He allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. Glancing down at his blood-stained tunic, he ripped it free in one swift motion. Before he could turn away, a nearby nobleman draped a richly embroidered brocade robe across his shoulders. The Red Earl, standing guard by the platform, sniffed the air. There was a sharp tang of alcohol clinging to Charles's skin. He raised an eyebrow and then offered a wry grin. "Bath, Charles?" the Earl asked, amusement dancing in his eyes. Charles's own eyebrow lifted at the question. The Earl extended his hand in a mock bow and let out a hearty laugh. "Come on, then. Your Highness smells like you've been marooned at sea." With a nod, Charles followed him toward the back exit. A final kick sent the auction house's rear door crashing open. Beyond it lay the aftermath of the slaughter. Overturned tables, shattered crates, and bodies strewn across the dusty floorboards. From the shadows under chairs, survivors peered out at the carnage, eyes wide with terror. Charles paused for a moment, surveying the ruin he'd wrought, and for the first time in a long while, he felt truly free. These survivors had been extraordinarily lucky. They'd lived, and Charles had spared them. Somewhere in the corner of the emptied auction hall, a trembling man lifted his head and peered around. "Are we really going? We're leaving?" His voice was barely more than a whisper, but in the sudden hush it echoed off the walls. When no ominous shadow appeared, no sign of the god of death, others dared to look up. One of them burst out, "Run! I swear I'll never set foot in a place like this again." A disheveled young nobleman seized the moment and bolted for the main gate. In an instant, the others followed. With a thunderous clang, the heavy doors swung open, and the survivors poured into the courtyard, shoving past one another in their desperate flight. By a rough count, only about 50 people had made it out alive. Nearly 300 had registered for the auction. Over 200 were slaughtered by Xia Luosuo's rampage, not to mention late arrivals and the auction staff who never stood a chance. It was only Charles's sudden mercy that granted these 50 a second chance at life. The moment the auction hall's doors burst open, the street outside erupted in chaos. Nobles, once the picture of poise and privilege, scrambled and staggered into the open air, their finely tailored coats and silken gowns fluttering as they fled. Onlookers gaped. To see these aristocrats reduced to a panicked stampede was extraordinary. Inside, the auction's inventory had been emptied in minutes, bidders abandoning both goods and money in their rush for the exits. When the dust settled, only Major General Wells and his naval officers remained. Wells stood rooted to the spot, his eyes glazed as they swept over the carnage, shattered crates, overturned pedestals, and worst of all, the bodies strewn across the polished floor. He didn't even notice Charles slipping away through a side corridor. How could this be? How could he do something so merciless? Wells muttered, voice thick with disbelief. At his side, the colonel, his face pale but steady, hesitated, then knelt beside him. "Your Excellency, Major General." Wells' lips moved, but no coherent reply came. The colonel summoned his courage. "Sir, Major General." A sharp tone of command finally cut through Wells's stupor. He blinked, refocused, and turned to face the colonel. Swallowing the thought, Colonel reported, "Sir, the pirate Charles has slipped away. Shall we give chase?" Captain Parker's voice wavered. He didn't want to give chase after witnessing Charles's brutal rampage. His legs still shook at the very thought of him. Yet somehow the words tumbled out. "Chase him. Absolutely. We have to." Major General Wells nodded before he even realized what he'd said. Then he snapped himself back to attention. "Wait, let me alert headquarters first." He drew the comm bug from his pocket and tapped at its screen. The little device crackled, foam oozed from its speaker grill, and then it died. Wells stared at it, stunned. What on earth? Losing contact with Naval Headquarters was unthinkable. He straightened in his chair. Colonel Sinclair! Colonel Sinclair, standing at ease nearby, recognized the general's alarm. Sir? Wells forced himself to stay calm. Send a small detachment to shadow Charles from a safe distance. No engagement yet. As soon as our comms are restored, report in and await further instructions on pursuit. Understood, sir. Sinclair snapped to attention, saluted crisply, and hurried out to issue his orders. Charles heard every word plainly. They were planning to bathe. His only task was to cover the bathhouse's exterior. As soon as the deputy slipped away, Sergeant Wells collapsed into the nearest armchair, sweat darkening his back. Seizing the moment, Charles slipped off into the shadows. The walled backcourt was still and oppressive. One by one, the caged slaves lifted hollow, expectant faces toward him. They'd heard the commotion in the front hall, cries for mercy, the harsh ring of steel, and knew without doubt it had been their liberator who'd caused it. The weight of their stares pressed on Charles's chest, but he ignored it and focused on the nearest cell. Inside, a little girl huddled against the far wall, eyes squeezed shut in terrified anticipation. At the sight of him, she recoiled, convinced he had come to punish her. Charles forced a gentle smile and knelt beside her. With a deft twist, he snapped the iron locking bar. The latch fell free with a dull clang. He slid the door open and offered her a hand. He didn't stop there. Moving from one cage to the next, Charles bent each bar, snapped each lock, until every slave in the yard could step out into the cool night air as a free person at last. Charles didn't bother fiddling with the latch. With a single swing of his hammer, he smashed the padlock to splinters. If anyone wanted to leave, they would have to push the iron doors open themselves. He did it on purpose, forcing them to experience freedom rather than remain caged. When he was done, Charles rejoined the Red Earl and held out his hand. Shall we go? Together, they walked away. Behind them, the prison yard fell silent. The cell doors stood ajar, but none of the captives stirred. A gentle nudge would have been enough to swing them wide, yet they remained frozen in place. After what felt like an eternity, the smallest of the prisoners finally moved, a little girl whose shackle Charles had torn from her ankle. She hauled her trembling body forward and with dusty fingers pressed against the cage door. Crunch! The iron groaned and swung open, its echo ringing across the courtyard. All eyes fixed on her as she stepped out, each cautious footfall wary of the unknown beyond her cage. Once she stood free on the stone floor, she whirled back to gaze at the cell that had held her captive, and a clear, bell-like laugh bubbled from her lips. A bright, liberated smile lit up her face. Hearing the little girl's laughter, the slaves inside the cage lifted their heads in unison and pressed their hands against the door, forcing it open. Chapter 78, Invitation. A wave of laughter broke out in the auction hall, rolling from one corner to the next until the air itself seemed to tremble with relief. Ha! Woo! Tears of joy streamed down the faces of the newly freed, and one by one they dropped to their knees, kowtowing toward the exit. Only those who have tasted the depths of despair can truly cherish the sweetness of freedom, and Charles watched them all with calm, observant eyes. Stepping through a concealed side door, Charles guided the Red Earl out into the moonlit street. They slipped past narrow alleys and lantern-lit storefronts, on their way to find the nearest bathhouse, a small measure of comfort after days of harrowing captivity. Unbeknownst to Charles, his crew had fanned out across the city in search of him. By the docks, a dozen anxious men clustered on the deck of a merchant ship. At their center stood Paul, brow furrowed, voice tight with worry. "Brother Paul," one sailor called out, "where is Boss Charles? We agreed to meet here at sundown. Why hasn't he shown?" Paul ran a hand through his hair. He knew Charles better than anyone, and this silence was unlike him. Something must have kept him, but what? The men shifted uneasily around Paul as dusk deepened over the harbor, each heartbeat echoing with unanswered questions. Paul held up a hand. "Wait, hold on a bit longer. Maybe the boss's return is just delayed." He glanced at Isaac, who stood nearby. "Isaac, if he's not back in 30 minutes, take 10 men and spread out through the water capital to look for him. I'll stay and guard the ship. If he shows up, I'll signal you." Isaac nodded. With that, Paul and the rest of the 20-strong crew settled in for the wait. 30 minutes later, when their leader still hadn't appeared, Isaac assembled his 10 volunteers and strode off toward the city, leaving Paul to keep watch. At the edge of the water capital, Charles and the Red Earl stepped into the grand bathing city's steaming marble pool. Warm water curled around their ankles, while a trained attendant kneaded Charles's shoulders, her skilled hands easing every knot. "Ah, this is perfect," Charles sighed, tilting his head back to let the tight muscles in his neck unwind. The Red Earl reclined against the pool's rim, cool water lapping at his chest. He eyed Charles with a teasing smile. "So, Charles, any thoughts about coming aboard my ship?" Charles raised an eyebrow. "Is that your idea of an invitation?" The Earl chuckled softly and pushed himself up until he hovered just above the water. "We work well together. If you come on board, I'll make you my first mate." Charles considered the offer, the warmth of the bath and the promise of adventure mingling into an intoxicating proposition. In the distance, Isaac's group moved among the lantern-lit canals of the city, still searching, still hopeful. But here, in the glow of the bathing city, Charles weighed his next move under the Red Earl's steady gaze. Charles leaned over the edge of the wooden tub, arms folded as he watched the Red Earl across the room. Steam curled around them, filling the cramped quarters with warmth and a faint scent of pine. "So," he asked, voice calm but insistent, "are you really going to quit the Rock's pirates?" The Red Earl's gaze remained steady and solemn. After a moment, he nodded. "Soon." Charles didn't press for details. He could feel the storm gathering on the horizon. The Battle of the Valley of the Gods was about to tear their world apart, and even now, Locke was gearing up for his own downfall. Charles knew he'd have to carve out an escape long before the fighting began. Once you claimed the pirate's life, it never let you go. He straightened in the water, droplets sliding down his arms. "Aren't you afraid Locke will refuse you? Or worse, punish you for turning your back on him?" Surprise flickered in the Earl's eyes. Despite the short time they'd sailed together, he already had a clear sense of Charles's unshakable resolve. The Earl stepped closer, lowering his voice. "What if I Tifado? LD, you rocks would be dead within a year? Would you believe me?" Charles's eyes shot wide open. The water stilled around him as he stared at the Earl, his mind racing. The room fell silent, heavy with unspoken knowledge. Rather than question how Charles could know such a dire prediction, the Red Earl simply met his gaze, lost in thought. Finally, he let out a slow sigh. "I refuse." The Red Earl didn't bother to look at Charles. "Oh ho," he said, his tone firm. Charles barely reacted to the refusal. Only a faint "oh" slipped from his lips. The Red Earl arched an eyebrow. "That's the wrong response. If most people were turned down, they'd at least ask why. You don't even seem to be inviting me." A playful smile curved the Red Earl's lips. "Did you really think I was an ordinary person?" Charles rolled his eyes but spoke quietly. He'd been ready for the Red Earl's refusal. After only a day together, he hadn't expected to lure such a solitary figure onto his boat so easily. "Ha-ha!" he said, almost to himself. The Red Earl choked on a laugh and shook his head in amusement. He found Charles endlessly entertaining. Every exchange felt fresh, unlike his interactions with others. With most people, he never had to strive for conversation. He could almost read their minds and anticipate their every word. It had been years since anyone had surprised him like this. The Red Earl settled back into his chair, swirling the ruby-red wine in his goblet. For a moment, he was silent, memories drifting in on the rolling waves of his mind. He remembered that raucous band of pirates he'd joined as a boy, the first time he'd ever felt truly alive. He never thought he'd feel that spark again, until now, sitting across from Charles. He raised his glass and took a measured sip. "I haven't asked you yet," he said, voice smooth but curious. "Why have you come to the first half of the Great Route? Are you on some mission you can't or won't discuss?" Charles lounged in the oversized bathtub, bubbles drifting lazily around him. He propped an arm on the rim, his dark hair damp and plastered to his forehead. 2 stray bubbles bobbed in front of his eyes, popping gently as he blinked. "There's nothing I can't tell you," he replied, with a faint, mischievous smile. "Don't I have enough leverage to set my own course? I heard there's an island somewhere here with a weapon that's just right for me. Thought I'd check it out. Satisfied?" The Red Earl's eyes sparked. He drained the last of his wine and leaned forward. "Perfect," he exclaimed. "When you find it, let me know. I'll come back and help you see that challenge through." Charles glanced up, an amused glint in his gaze. "Oh, so you think you can just swoop in, all grand and unstoppable, and take the victory alongside me?" He laughed softly. "You'd better work on that swagger first, Red Earl. Then maybe I'll let you tag along. Otherwise, you're not even my match." Charles's words cut through the air, and the Red Earl couldn't deny the truth of them. He felt the raw, overwhelming force radiating from the young swordsman. Even that battered blade Charles held unleashed formidable power. He shivered to imagine what might happen if Charles ever found a sword truly worthy of his skill. The Red Earl fell silent. After a moment, he swore under his breath. "Damn it, I almost forgot. My crew's waiting for me. If you hadn't reminded me, I'd have walked right off into the sunset." With that, Charles sprang from the steaming bath, sending droplets flying in every direction. The Red Earl narrowed his eyes, and the woman sharing the bath with Charles gasped in surprise at the sudden commotion. Charles shook the excess water from his hair. "No more bubbles for me," he declared, grinning. "My men will worry themselves sick if I vanish." Reluctantly, the Red Earl clambered out of the bath as well. Within minutes, both men were dressed and stepping out of the bathhouse into the cool evening air. Charles looked at his companion and sighed. "I suppose this is where we part ways." The Red Earl offered a lone nod, his usual composure flickering for a heartbeat into something almost like regret, though he'd never admit it aloud. Without another word, they turned in opposite directions, each walking back toward his own destiny. Charles had grown so used to his own company that solitude felt natural to him. "Then, until we meet again," he said, giving the Red Earl a respectful nod. "Farewell," the Earl replied with a warm smile. Chapter 79. Discussions at the Navy Headquarters. "Is this really goodbye?" A strange ache blossomed in the Red Earl's chest, an emotion he had never known. Charles allowed himself a small, wistful smile as he turned toward the docks where his ship waited. At once, his scholarly poise and the reputation it carried seemed to sweep across half of Seven Waters City. Ahead, in the heart of town, a restless throng had gathered. Word of the auction house incident had spread like wildfire, and panic rippled through the streets. Charles merely glanced at the commotion and turned away, unfazed. "Boss! Boss!" The familiar shouts reached him long before he set foot on the gangplank. As he climbed aboard, the crew surged forward, relief and impatience shining in their eyes. Charles lifted a hand in greeting, managing a wry smile. "Boss, where have you been? You had us tearing our hair out," one of them exclaimed. Paul hurried down the plank, nearly tripping over himself. He dropped to his knees at Charles's side, his voice cracking with relief. "Are you all right, boss? We were so worried." Charles offered a patient, amused look. Paul's theatrics were, as ever, over the top, but endearing all the same. "Don't worry so much," Charles said. "I ran into someone interesting. Lost track of time, that's all. We're good to depart now." One of the deckhands called out, "All right, boss, but just hold on a moment longer. We're still loading the last of the supplies." Charles nodded. "Very well. Give me 5 minutes." As the crew scurried to finish their work, the Red Earl stood on the gangplank and gazed at the harbor. Seven Waters City stretched before him, the center of so much uncertainty, and yet the world to which he belonged. Today, at least, he would set sail once more. Paul scanned the horizon, frustration etched on his face. "Charles hasn't returned yet. I've sent Isaac to look for him. I'll fire a signal flare so the others know to fall back." Charles gave a curt nod. He knew they hadn't done anything wrong. They just needed backup. Paul reached inside his coat and pulled out a slender bamboo tube. He raised it to his lips and called out, "Fire!" With a sharp hiss, the tube launched a single arrow straight into the night sky. Moments later, it burst into a brilliant firework, a cloud-piercing arrow that lit up the darkness. Far away, Isaac, who'd been scouring the shores of the Seven Waters capital, paused at the sudden flash and boom overhead. Recognition sparked in his eyes. "That's our signal," he barked to his men. "Fall back to the ship. The boss has returned." Within minutes, Isaac led his small company racing across the docks toward Paul and Charles's vessel. Charles waited on the bow, his gaze fixed on the moonlit waters. Before long, Isaac and his men clambered aboard. "Boss?" Isaac called out as soon as he stepped onto the deck. All accounted for? Charles asked quietly. Isaac saluted. Yes, sir. No trouble. Just some startled guards. Charles gave a low whistle of approval. Good. Hoist the sails. The crew sprang into action. Canvas stretched, ropes tightened, and the ship began to glide away from the crowded port, cutting through the gentle swell. Seated at the prow, Charles stared out at the receding lights of the city. A sudden chill ran down his spine. He lifted his head, senses alert, and turned to scan the dark horizon. Something was coming, and he could feel it. A lone figure stood atop the tiled roof, cloaked in a flowing purple robe. It was the Red Earl. He watched as Charles's ship slipped away across the harbor, its sails glowing in the morning light. Spotting the Earl's steady gaze, Charles turned, offered a brief, confident smile, and lifted his hand in salute. The Red Earl quirked the corner of his mouth in return, eyes lingering on the vessel until it vanished into the haze. A sudden thud echoed through the council chamber as Cyborg Sora slammed her fist on the table. What did you just say? Charles actually went on a killing spree in the water capital? From the far end of the long conference table, the voice of Agent Wells crackled through the concealed earpiece. He spoke with careful precision. Your Excellency, Charles was detained by the Slave Patrol for public intoxication. When he came to, he found himself locked in the auction house. In a blind fury, he slaughtered nearly everyone inside. Only a handful escaped with their lives. Damn it! Damn Charles! Cyborg Kong roared, sending a stack of data pads skidding across the table. Your Excellency, Wells continued, his tone now edged with alarm. We've lost all trace of him. His ship never docked anywhere after he left port, and none of our patrol logs record his passage. He's vanished without a clue. Silence fell over the chamber as the enormity of the situation settled in. Charles had not only slipped through their fingers, he had left a trail of blood in his wake and vanished into thin air. Do you have new orders? Wells asked into his earpiece, scanning the faces of the operatives behind him. A few stiffened at the question, leaning in as though they could decipher the reply through the bugged line. Ever since the disaster at the auction house, they'd been on edge, afraid that Charles might pick up their trail again. Quietly, they'd sabotaged every lead, fed false information, stalled reports, until Charles seemed to vanish entirely. Even Wells had never suspected. Beside him, the colonel remained unreadable, the true architect of the mission's derailment. Wells's voice still echoed in the hidden microphone when Steelbone Kong, the colonel's lieutenant, froze mid-step. 3 heavy seconds passed without a sound. Then, bang! A sudden crash crackled through the line, jolting Wells's heart into his throat. The colonel and the rest tensed, cold sweat beading on their brows. Answer me, Wells snapped. The line crackled. Heavy breathing, ragged and exhausted, filled the speakers. Should we pull the team back? Kong's voice came, weary, and then the connection went dead. Wells let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Withdrawal, for now, was their only option. General Steelbone Kong didn't blame Wells one bit. In fact, Colonel Shi and the Marines standing behind him visibly relaxed. Wells carefully pocketed the bugged phone, then turned back to his men. Tighten formation. With that, he strode off toward the docks, 30-odd sailors close on his heels. At Navy headquarters, General Steelbone Kong rapped his metal-fused fist on the conference table 3 times. The echo reverberated through the hall. Admirals Crest and Warfield hurried forward. What's the situation with the field unit? Crest asked, voice urgent. Warfield added, we heard something went wrong in the Seven Rivers capital. Steelbone pinched the bridge of his nose. It wasn't our Marines who caused it. It was Charles. He slid a hollow tablet across to them. He stormed the auction hall and massacred nearly 700 people. Wells has the full report right here. Crest and Warfield exchanged glances, then tapped the tablet screen to scroll through Wells's briefing. Both men fell silent, brows knitting tighter by the second. Illegal slave trade ring, Crest read aloud, tone flat. That's been outlawed by the world government for decades. Warfield's jaw clenched. And yet this, in the heart of the Seven Rivers capital, they were selling humans like cattle. General Steelbone rose, voice low but resolute. Charles blew the lid off a state-sponsored slave network. We have to decide our response, and fast. Charles and his companions stared in silent frustration. There was nothing they could do. The Chambord Islands, just off the coast of Marin Vanduo, hosted daily slave auctions, and the Navy was forced to look the other way. Powerful interests lay behind the trade, bolstered by the backing of the Tianlong clan, and even naval headquarters dared not intervene. "Isn't the governor of the Seven Waters capital named Hoyle?" Crane asked, brows knitting together. His memory was razor-sharp. "He's an appointee of the world government, right?" Cyborg Sora via metallic nod. "Exactly. Hoyle was installed by the world government and answers only to them." At the mention of such brazen corruption, Django's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Steelbone's hollow exhaled in resignation, the helplessness of it all weighing on his mechanical frame. Now that this case has drawn the attention of world government officials, our Navy cannot become directly involved. We could still apprehend the fugitive murderer Charles, except our surveillance teams report that he's vanished without a trace. In these vast seas, locating a single individual is all but impossible. Consequently, we have no choice but to suspend active pursuit and raise the bounty on Charles. This announcement will also serve as the world government's official statement on the matter. Chapter 80, Rewards. Cyborg Kong flipped through the data dossier in his hand and sighed. Steelbone Kong's proposal had won immediate silent approval from both Sengoku and Admiral Crane. There really was no better option. Despite the Navy's recent surge in enlistments, raw recruits still needed months of training before they could be deployed. And to apprehend Charles, they would need only the most elite fighters, far too few to spare for a global manhunt. Sengoku leaned forward, tapping his desk. "Then what bounty should we post?" Charles's current bounty has already reached 5 billion berries, by far the highest in the world. Cyborg Kong stroked his chin thoughtfully. "Let's go with 1 billion. With his reputation, his value will climb there in no time. After all, that renowned swordsman's skill alone could command 1 billion. Steelbone Kong rapped his metal forehead with a gloved fist. 1 billion it is. Let's see who dares to take this challenge, if they can even get close. All right, I'll issue the wanted notices. Admiral Kong spoke up from the side. And put one out for the red-haired too. Let's set his bounty at 205 million berries, just under Charles's. That'll spark some friction between them. Fleet Admiral Sengoku frowned. Are you sure there's no downside to raising the bounty so drastically at once? Admiral Sora waved him off with a half-smile. What danger is there? Pirates are flooding the seas these days, yet compared to the Golden Age, things are eerily quiet. Ever since his promotion, Sora had watched the New World grow wilder, especially after the re-emergence of the rocks. Pirates scrambled the balance in the second half of the Grand Line. Pirate crews multiplied overnight, and the Marines have struggled to suppress them. Sengoku fell silent at Sora's words. When the two admirals paused, the fleet admiral nodded and quietly ordered his staff to finalize the new bounties. As Sora and Kong exited the room, Kong's grin spoke volumes. This simple decree would unleash major turmoil across the seas. No sooner had the bulletin been released than newspaper boys clamored through every port, hawking the explosive front page, from Reverse Mountain all the way to Beehive Island. Wanted, Charles, 210,000 berries. Red-haired Shanks, 205,000 berries. Captain Rox leaned back in his throne-like chair the moment his aide burst into the room, clutching the morning paper. "Sir," the man panted, "we've just received word from Captain Charles of the 8th Division. He's made a major move in the Seven Seas capital." Rox took the paper with one hand and flipped it open. The front page was dominated by an eye-catching headline, a string of zeros indicating the body count, and a gruesome photograph splashed across the center. He raised an eyebrow. "Unbelievable," he murmured. "The so-called Bloodsword Charles carried out that massacre right in the heart of Water City." His aide swallowed hard. Over 1,000 villagers were slaughtered on the island. Then he slipped away, leaving the Navy high and dry. Rox flicked through the rest of the paper, scarcely interested in the lesser stories. "What about Heitan Muchan? Has he returned yet?" The aide lowered his gaze. "Not yet, sir. I've sent several messages, but there's been a delay." Rox's expression darkened. He reached into his coat, pulled out a sleek comm device, and tapped the screen. It buzzed to life almost immediately. "Heitan," Rox rumbled as soon as the line clicked open. Report in. Silence answered him for a heartbeat, then the call went through. Hayton Muchen ended the call and turned to his sister, anxiously rubbing his forehead. Sister, do you really think Captain Locks bought what we told him? Hayton Chanwan crossed her arms and gave him a sharp look. It's not about fooling him, it's about steering him. Besides, I didn't lie. Our family archive genuinely contains that ancient text. It mentions the King of Heaven and locates the Valley of the Gods. Muchen frowned. Then why didn't you owe L. Locks that the valley only opens every 40 years, and that the next opening isn't until next year? Chanwan's lips curved into a satisfied smirk. If we'd handed him every detail up front, we'd have lost all our leverage. It's far better to keep him hunting and keep us in control. Hayton Muchen paced the deck of the flagship, the salt wind tugging at his dark hair. He fixed his younger brother with a hard glare. We owe our captaincies in the 7th Division to our usefulness, he snarled. If Locke didn't see value in us, we'd have been chucked overboard long ago. Don't forget, you only just survived that last encounter with the pirates. And remember Charles? He nearly killed you himself. If Locke hadn't stepped in, you'd be meeting Amaterasu by now. Hayton Chanmaru bowed his head, stung by the reminder of their narrow escape. Exiles from Wano country, the two brothers had spent every waking moment nursing the same dream, return home and reclaim their birthright. Now allied with the fearsome Rocks pirates, they finally had a chance to make that dream real. Muchen stopped pacing and turned to face him fully. By the way, any news on that devil fruit? Shenmaru shook his head. Nothing concrete. I've scoured every port, every backwater island. No trace. The only lead I've found is that Locke himself hasn't left that last island. My guess? Rox's crew got their hands on the fruit first. At the mention of the devil fruit, Chanmaru's posture straightened. In Wano, the legendary fruit was more than a supernatural weapon. It was the very symbol of their nation's power. If they could seize it, the Hayton clan would finally hold the leverage they needed to march back into Wano and restore their honor. A hard smile curved across Muchen's lips. Then we press on, no rest until we have it in our hands. Chanmaru returned the smile, eyes burning with renewed purpose. Very well, let's make it happen. Keep an eye out for any news about that devil fruit, Hayton Muchen urged his younger brother, Chanwan, anxiety flickering in his dark eyes. Tell me the moment you hear anything. Right away, Chanwan replied with a steady nod. At that, Muchen finally allowed himself a small, relieved exhale. The merchant ship glided through the open sea under a bright sky, Charles's ship, crewed by traders and sailors bound for the next port. On deck, Paul leaned against the rail, scanning the horizon with a bored expression. Life aboard a slow merchantman had its limits, and today seemed to offer none of the usual bustle. Then a feathered form dipped into view overhead, a seagull trained to sell newspapers. Paul's eyes lit up, and he waved at the bird. Hey, over here! I want a paper! The gull circled down, letting out an eager squawk. Paul fished 50 berries from his pouch and tossed them up. With a deft catch, the gull dropped a fresh bundle of papers at Paul's feet before wheeling away. Paul snatched up the top sheet and flipped it open, scanning the headlines. Within moments, other crew members drifted over, curious. Out on the endless blue, with nothing to break the monotony except the lapping waves, today's headlines were as good as any entertainment.